Hello everyone, welcome back into another stream of Last Protagonist reacting to a Shadow of the Erdtree critique. I hope you're doing well. Hi little boy. So like I said, we're going to continue with what we had left off yesterday with TheoTTree's Shadow of the Erdtree critique. It took me a lot longer to go through this video than I was expecting, but I was enjoying myself. So we got into the section about spirit ashes, and we only got like a couple of minutes into it, so I'll probably back up so that way we have more of the context for this section of the video. But anyway, welcome back in, everybody. We have Zyro, Mendacious Cat, Platinum Chip, Galaxy Dragon already. How's it going? All right, so how did that even happen? Is it because I pressed C? Now I know. So C is the button for closed caption, so I just wasn't clicking on the YouTube's window. Mendacious, you just switched to playing Shadow of the Erdtree. What were you playing before? I can't remember off the top of my head. Alright. So anyway, without further ado, let's go into TheoTTree's second half of his Shadow of the Erdtree critique, and I'm going to back it up a little bit. Okay.
Style transformative. I changed the inputs, but the output is pretty much identical, but with some numbers shifted. If From wants me to stop rolling, they need to stop making it work so reliably for the overwhelming majority of their games.
So, right, just to give a bit of a recap, he talked about the camera, telegraphing attacks, most replayed, I can't tell what this actually is, Rolana and fainting, Golden Hippo, Mesmer, stamina, weight, and physicality, unremarkable combat, which, that's interesting, it's a choice, difficulty, TheoTTree fragments, because he prefers exploring like he wants to and not feeling forced to go on a scavenger hunt just to be able to fight bosses at their seemingly intended difficulties. Then further options, don't remember what he meant about that. And now we'll be getting into the spirit ashes. Mendacious Cat, you were playing Remnant from the Ashes for a little while and just switched to Shadow of the Erdtree before the notification popped. Okay. Platinum Chip, you're about to crush some Unreal Tournament 04 epic game. Wow. What are you getting? Okay. All right, so here we go.
The last possible thing on the docket is spirit ashes. Spirit ashes are summons, essentially, just summoning in an NPC ally rather than another player. They don't improve the boss's statistics when used.
Okay, now I remember. I think further options was him responding to people complaining about his lack of using the tools that the developers gave him. So, you know what? I'm actually going to go all the way back to the beginning of the further options section, because I think that'll lead into the ashes tangent a bit more clearly. Okay, so I'm going to back it up again.
Next, I've received a pretty substantial sentiment that I'm ignoring a lot of tools to deal with damage, or ways to avoid damage other than rolling. I'm unduly concluding that rolling is the only option, when in fact there's many. Several Ashes of War act as evasive tools, jumping exists, shields exist, some spells even provide defensive benefits. In the face of all of this, how can I reasonably say that rolling is almost the sole defensive maneuver and stick to that in my own gameplay? It seems almost intentionally obtuse. The problem with this line of argumentation is that it is one that, again, simply pertains to difficulty. And difficulty isn't the problem. High difficulty simply serves to exacerbate what is already present.
You know, thinking about this a bit more, I was talking about how shields can give you situational advantages and stuff like that. I think one reason why there is a bit of a merit to the complaints about the game being centered around dodge rolling is that that is essentially the one tool in common between all builds. Granted, there are some varieties or variations with the medium roll, the fat roll, and the light roll, of course, but if you are designing a boss encounter, you can't necessarily have that boss have an attack that needs to be blocked, or if an attack is supposed to be blocked, then it can't do a ton of damage because that'll just dumpster a lot of builds that obviously aren't using shields or parrying or things like that. So that's probably another component to the dodge roll centric gameplay, because Elden Ring doesn't really have a Sekiro parry option. They did add in the deflecting card tier, which I think was really interesting, and I would have liked to have seen more stuff like that incorporated into the like base game in general. But the fact that it also has a fairly short timer is kind of very disappointing to me, and I much would have rather preferred that the deflecting hard tier's buff persisted until death. Hey! He's throwing a little puppy fit and like trying to move the pillow in such a way for him to get comfortable. And he was like, he somehow managed to get the pillowcase off of it and was still trying to like dig it and shove it around while it's in his mouth. So I don't want him to like break open the pillow. So sorry for yelling in everybody's ears, essentially. So what was I saying as I'm now fixing this pillowcase? Yeah, everybody has access to dodge rolling, and without deflecting hard tiers or shields or more mechanics solely designed on that, that is going to limit what they can do with combat, which is another reason why I think Kazan stands out with some of its combat, because it has like multiple different ways to parry, and it's kind of fun. Nightmare Maniac, welcome back in. Ask Next, Mike Bailey, nice to see all you guys again.
Equipping Bloodhound Step or some damage negation spell or what have you.
Oh, what breed is he? So he is a half Border Collie, half Greyhound, half pain in the butt.
What is already present. Equipping Bloodhound Step or some damage negation spell or what have you would simply serve to make things easier, rather than delete the design decisions that are causing me to come away with negative opinions. I don't think it's fair to say that bosses are designed around these techniques either. It would rather fly in the face of the player's freedom of choice in terms of their engagement and approach, which is a core design pillar, if the intended solution to boss fights was to replace whatever Ash of War you have and like with essentially a better dodge. This...
Oh yeah, the whole Bloodhound Step instead of the dodge stuff. And I did talk yesterday about how I do think some of the bosses are overtuned, where it seems like the only viable option is by having a light roll. Cough, cough. Promised consort Radon, cough. But we already discussed that yesterday.
All assuming you're using a weapon with the swappable Ash in the first place. I spent most of my first run using the Godslayer Greatsword, and you can't put Bloodhound Step on that. Nor would I want to if I could, frankly, because my roll was perfectly sufficient to deal with all the encounters I ran up against bar 2. Bloodhound Step, meanwhile, overly trivializes most boss patterns. I gain ease of access at the cost of my already diminished interest in engagement. There's a point at which I'd prefer not to bother at all, and using Bloodhound Step or some other Roll Plus Ash of War passes that point. Which leaves us with shields as the other alternative.
And yeah, just to reiterate the whole aspect, if you're using a unique weapon like the Godslayer's Greatsword, you can't even realistically have the option to use Bloodhound Step. Maybe that would have been a smart option to put that on the shield, and so that way, even if you're using a unique weapon, you could use a shield in your offhand to like make that work. Or if it, maybe like shield is too much, maybe if you had a left hand like glove only, which gave you no like real combat benefits, but it could give you an alternate Ash of War. But then I guess you could also ask, well then what's the utility of using that versus just making all weapons able to have switchable Ashes of War? I guess you could do some two-hand, one-hand shenanigans if you want to activate different Ashes of War. But anyway, Mike was saying my dog's got to have some serious energy and brains with that mix. A little bit of both. I think because I didn't know this until I had some friends who had a Greyhound, but apparently Greyhounds, although they're extremely fast and can be energetic while they're like in their play mode, quite a lot of them like to relax and lie around for quite a good majority of the day. So, of course, when my little guy was more of a puppy, he was certainly a handful, where if I would try to go outside and play fetch with him for 30 minutes or 45 minutes, he would want to do that multiple times a day, which is a little bit much. So I did the best I could, but now that he's getting older, he's settling down a lot more and seems to be more content with just playing super devotedly like once after dinner is essentially what I've Pavlovian conditioned him into doing. So he's a lot more manageable now, and he's a bit of a sleepy boy in the morning, which is quite nice compared to when he was a puppy. Hey, Stella, nice to see you again. Nightmare said, this is a tough criticism to take seriously, considering how you can take almost every boss and attack with a proper Great Shield build. So that's kind of part of the issue, though. Like, if the game will allow you to play without needing to use the Great Shields, then they should make those builds viable. Whereas something about the boss design in Shadow of the Erdtree specifically just seemed to kind of betray a lot of people's expectations. And those previous builds, which allowed people to have fun playing them, don't feel as fun coming into Shadow of the Erdtree than people may have been expecting.
Damage avoidance method. I did actually use a shield in my first playthrough, but only for Radahn, and only because he has an attack that I couldn't identify a strategy to consistently dodge, and at the time, neither could anyone else. I'm not sure if it has now been determined to be consistently rollable, but the strategy I saw employed entailed no armor, no punishing a huge number of potential windows, and sprinting left for half a second after just about every single action in the fight just in case he did it. It's this 3-hit string. It would, without picture-perfect positioning in the terrain that you can't consistently dictate, always roll catch me on the second hit. I couldn't roll through both the first 2 hits in any consistent manner. The hitboxes on his swords are large enough and his tracking strong enough that he will almost always catch you even if you try to go under the second strike. So yeah, I did use a shield. Once I was presented with an attack that I literally could not consistently evade, when the game essentially gave me no other choice.
And the thing that really gets me about this is that From really could have just slowed down the animations by a couple frames, and that would have given enough of a window for some builds to be able to kind of mitigate this fight a lot better. So I feel like they really could have tuned this a lot more, and they did to an extent, but they could have been more aggressive and kept players happier. So like most of my complaints about Shadow of the Erdtree is centered around the bosses, whereas I really liked aspects of the open world exploration. I felt like the balance there was completely fine, even without any Shadow Tree blessings. And well, I do wish there was like more to do at places, and that we had more NPCs like nomadic merchants to keep the world feeling a bit more alive after you complete the main quest. I did enjoy quite a lot of Shadow of the Erdtree for what it's worth. Galaxy asks, wasn't that fixed? He said it might have been fixed, but at least at the time when he was first playing that this was a big problem.
On my second playthrough I messed around with the deflect tier a bit instead, as you've probably been noticing, and bootlegged Sekiro is okay, I guess. Certainly the game is strictly improved if the deflect tier is simply a baseline mechanic, but a lot of what I'm annoyed with persists regardless of whether this is the case or not. Beyond the absolute extreme of the Radahn attack I mentioned before, shields occupy the same space they always have in Souls games. It's easier to execute on blocking than it is on rolling through attacks, but more or less strictly worse to do so. Blocking will, unless you heavily invest into building around it, and sometimes even then, consistently eat more of your stamina than the equivalent weight in rolls required to dodge through the same set of attacks. On top of this, blocking opens you up to dangers that are not there if you roll. You can get guard broken if you run out of stamina, you can get block stunned into follow-up attacks or lingering damage effects, the latter of which almost always deal damage types that will cause chip damage through your block, and many regular swings in the DLC have similar extra damage types on them with the same effect. To make a long story...
Oh yeah, Mendacious Cat, I can't believe that's what I had forgotten to mention. Well, I just didn't even think to bring it up. It's not as though I forgot like I meant to. Yeah, that was one of the things that annoyed me a lot about dealing with certain bosses like Rilana in particular, is that they became wars of attrition, mostly because they had additional elemental damage that you couldn't really mitigate with the vast majority of build options. So, like with Radahn, you'd need to more or less use like Miquella's Great Shield if you want to really cut down that holy damage, but they should have given more flexibility with Ashes of War or infusements, whatever you want to call them, to deal with elemental damage a bit more easily, I think, because it's pretty rough not being able to completely mitigate magical, physical, and fire damage against a boss like Rilana or that kind of thing. That's a good point. Hey, Jack Irish, welcome back in. You think a cool new weapon in the free DLC would be a frenzied greatsword? Does Midra's weapon actually use frenzy or no? I don't remember. Yeah, and that's another thing that I was really disappointed by with the DLC. I was seriously hoping that we'd get more weapon buff incantations or just buffs in general. So it's so bad that you get the Black Flame buff that lasts for like 4 seconds or something like that, like literally. And some of the other ones have like 30 seconds, but I would have much preferred that if we're going to be having these long rolling boss fights that last minutes at a time, to at least have like minute-long buffs or even longer, maybe until death, if you have like the high enough stats for them. Like, why not? There was no... Okay, it does not do that. Interesting. Yeah, and that was the other thing. It's like, there's buffs like Death Blight and Frenzied Flame that you can't really do anything with, but they're pretty cool, and it'd be fun to like build around them, even though you don't really have a lot of so-called tarnished enemies to afflict those status effects onto. And Mendacious says the Black Flame doc got nerfed for the DLC. Yeah. Well, Black Flame, they may have nerfed it because so many RL1 builds would use it, because that's like one of the only few incantations you can even bother to use at that low of a level. Mendacious says, buff duration scaling off of your stats is a DS2 thing. I didn't necessarily mean like scaling off of your stats specifically, as much as like having a high enough stat requirement to be able to cast the spell to begin with. If you want to keep it gated from like early game Andes. But I also wouldn't necessarily mind buff duration scaling off of stats as well.
Story short, blocking puts me in positions where I'm worse off coming out of an attack string than I would have been had I learned to roll it. And as we've already established, my contention isn't difficulty. And I prefer interaction with the boss moveset such that I attain mastery over it in a way that precludes blocking in its current design.
I also hate that meteor attack, because how is anybody realistically supposed to
boss
learn that
moveset such
jump
that
over
I attain
these?
mastery over
Like,
it in a
the camera does not help, but I mean, it looks like that should hit you, sort of. I mean, it obviously missed him here, but that attack annoyed the hell out of me until I heard through the grapevine that you're supposed to jump over them, and then I didn't have a problem with it after the fact.
a way that precludes blocking in its current design. Hell, blocking instead of rolling even often costs me access to the consistent best attack of most weapons movesets, being the roll.
So Jack asks, do we think that we truly defeated Mikola, or do you think he'll eventually come back and we just delayed him greatly? If we killed Promised Consort Radahn's body, and that's what drew Mikola's soul back down to the Shadow Realm, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, then I'm assuming that they're going to be gone for good. I don't necessarily think we destroyed their souls, but they probably would go back out into the ether and be reincarnated, depending on what ending you choose, I guess, as the Elden Lord.
Even often costs me access to the consistent best attack of most weapons movesets, being the rolling R1. Rolling R1s are fast, especially for colossal swords. It's a very good move that lets you weave in damage between strings or between attacks in a string in a way that is much more wieldy than a guard counter, even if the guard counter has higher reward. So yeah, I don't really want to block, and outside of the things in the game that are literally undodgeable or close enough to that point, I'm going to stick to dodging for the most part. Blocking does nothing for me that I want, as opposed to rolling. All I get is ease, which is not something I care about. If shields presented more in terms of legitimate trade-off against just iframing through everything, I may feel differently. Currently, that trade-off is non-playstyle transformative. I change the inputs, but the output is pretty much identical, but with some numbers shifted.
I am surprised that he didn't bring up pairing at all in the video yet, especially as extra options, and he doesn't really seem to get to that point, but I guess like pairing isn't necessarily limited to being on shields, but my goodness, for the life of me, I cannot figure out the timing of like the curved greatsword or the curved sword parry. Like it just seems to not work for me specifically. It just takes an act of God to make it work. So, yeah.
If From wants me to stop rolling, they need to stop making it work so reliably for the overwhelming majority of their games. The last possible thing on the docket is Spirit Ashes. Spirit Ashes are summons, essentially, just summoning in an NPC ally rather than another player. They don't improve the boss's statistics when used the way a regular summon does, but they cost you some FP, or in one case health, to summon.
There's a couple more that use health, but may not be as viable as one would like. Hey, Pastor Muppets, nice to see you again.
I've seen it said quite a lot that Elden Ring, and this DLC especially, are balanced around ashes, and as such to not use them is to place an unnecessary difficulty burden on the player, or not using the tools the game gives you, or something to that effect. It's an option in the game and it would make matters easier, which would mean less time spent on frustrating content. So why not? Because, put simply, I think they make the play experience worse. They definitely make things easier, but this isn't always good, and the way they make things easier is by no means a good thing. They're a part of the game, absolutely, but the game doesn't really account for them well in terms of balancing. Especially not the likes of Mimic Tear or Black Knife Tiche. The reality of the matter for all of them, though, is that Souls bosses don't do well against multiple opponents. Their attacks are designed almost exclusively around interactions with a single opponent that behaves in the way a Dark Souls player character does. You can see this with how incredibly open they leave themselves to threats from other directions when they're executing a string on a target. Ashes buy you some unbelievable punish windows in these games, and this is then compounded by them putting out their own damage, with little to no regard for their own well-being.
Yeah, one of my complaints about Shadow the Erdtree is that it almost felt mandatory to have a target dummy of sorts for the boss to get locked onto in order for me to finish casts of some spells. Now, granted, I don't necessarily think I should get a full-on, completely pressed down cast of Exike's Rotting Breath and make that work, but there were plenty of times where it's really hard to go through the wind-up animation to even get like the first wave of breath on a boss. Now, there are times you can pick and choose your shots, but the overall frenetic pacing of combat in the DLC was something that I felt was a little bit more arbitrary than warranted. I don't know how to finish that thought.
That's a lot more damage, with a lot less having to care about what the boss is doing. They're so capable in this capacity that I can't imagine the play experience was designed with them in mind. They have an immensely trivializing effect on encounters with a level of grandiosity in their presentation and a degree of mechanical difficulty in their design and their tuning that it would be extremely strange if From were perfectly fine with them getting trivialized and barely interacted with. I mean, I've seen Tiche and Mimic Tear borderline solo boss fights while the player sits back and spectates. There's nothing in the boss design of these DLCs that indicates they're being designed around ashes. Their combos are still incredibly single-entity focused, their health and stance tuning is not such that they're able to tolerate two entities wailing on them, and their AI is easily manipulated to spend the bulk of its attention beating up the summon.
Though this seems to be harder with the DLC bosses. I kind of disagree a little bit, whereas I feel like some of these boss attacks in the DLC are much more sweeping in nature to kind of hit multiple targets that are more or less in front of them to a degree. But to be fair, it is always been a weakness of most enemies in FromSoft games that they are weak to being stabbed in the back. Go figure. Hey, Iman, nice to see you again.
And if they are intended, then I'm forced to conclude that From's intentions are that the play experience be worse, which is hardly compelling. For my part, my preference, both with these games and beyond, is that I want to beat the challenges presented to me on their own terms. I want to play ball with the encounter, so to speak. I want to know how to effectively deal with anything they can do, rather than put myself in a position where I don't care about any of their game actions.
I agree with this, and the way that I would frame it would be that I get enjoyment out of what I consider to be mastery of boss encounters, and to an extent, having excess ashes or spirit uses or summon uses kind of diminishes my feeling of mastery over certain boss encounters. So For instance, when I was first fighting the Millennia, I got her down to phase 2, like on my own. And then once I realized she had like a legitimate phase 2, I'm like, this is dumb. I'm going to use my Mimic tier just so I don't have to spend so long getting through phase 1. So I have the chance to like learn phase 2. So uh, sometimes when I had experiences like that, I would get to like the first phase and deliberately let my spirit die, so that way I could go into the second phase and continue like the mano a mano type stuff. Because to me, it's more about consistency than anything, and I'm not extremely consistent as a player, so um, it's just kind of getting rid of a certain level of tedium when I would summon that way sometimes. But generally, I do prefer the one-on-one fighting playstyle, and that's what I find fun. So when people say, hey, you're not using all the tools the devs gave you, well, sure, in a way, but I'm not going to have as much fun if I'm doing it another way. And I play the game to have fun, and the current boss setup is less fun than I would like. And so I don't think they're wrong for pointing out that you're not doing things with all of your tools available, but this seems to be like more of a newer problem in the DLC. Well, it's not like a newer problem, but it seems to be exacerbated in the DLC. Whereas that was kind of more of a an edge case for me to not enjoy boss designs enough that I'd want to summon in the base game. Welcome back in, Halo. You said this is a non-argument because spirit summons are essentially like co-op. You do not need to make use of them. The same issues exist with co-op, and that's been in every Souls game. To be fair, there is a difference in that the spirit ashes don't buff the enemy health, but I digress. Nightmare says, do I feel that spirit ashes were a mistake to put in the game? Absolutely not. I mean, if the spirit ashes make the game more fun for other people, I say more power to them. I think the more elegant solution would be that if spirit ashes were used, then perhaps the bosses should either have more moves or perhaps more health to compensate, or vice versa would be that you have a certain amount of a buff added to your character natively if you don't use the spirit ash, and then if you use the spirit ash, that buff goes away to kind of mitigate that kind of advantage. And then I think the game would probably feel perhaps a bit more fair. But a lot of my complaints about the DLC bosses in particular are more like moveset related than anything else. Hey Kyle, welcome back in. You understand what I'm saying, but it's like playing Fear with no time manipulation. Yeah, you're proving you can do it, but it's kind of a different game. I don't understand the Fear reference, so unfortunately that went over my head. Halo said the health buff is irrelevant because that too is an optional mechanic. I'm just saying that there are different ways that like the spirit ashes interact with the bosses than co-op. And co-op, there's no consistency with it unless you're specifically summoning friends, which I think that's perfectly fair. And that in itself is another aspect of considering things, because co-op, you could also have that kind of personal relationship with somebody that can heighten the experience, especially if you're on a call with them or something to that effect. So I do think there are differences, even if you're talking about like the fundamental gameplay in a vacuum. Spirit Ashes give a lot more consistency, and you can kind of tailor them how you like, whereas you can't really do that so much with co-op. Kyle said the runs they've done without Spirit Ashes felt easier. You can control the boss's movements and reactions more when it's just you. It just takes longer because you're doing less damage. And that's kind of how I feel about it as well, because once you kind of understand how the boss AI is supposed to work, Spirit Ashes and multiple targets just kind of add an element of uncertainty to things, which makes it less consistent overall. Asenik said, what about having Spirit Ashes eating souls/runes? I mean, for me, like, the experience isn't even really part of the reward when I consider it like a boss encounter. It's just more of a nice thing to get, but Captini, welcome in. That'd be the same problem as farming those paper dolls in Sekiro. Were you responding to Asenex or something else? Halo said, in Fear, you can slow down time whenever you want, enabling you to tactically deal with unexpected threats. It's a resource like stamina. Oh, okay, okay. So it's kind of like bullet time or VATS, perhaps, but maybe a bit more involved. Nightmare said, the DLC bosses would have been almost perfect with a Bloodborne rally aggression system and speed. There is Millennia's Great Rune. Granted, it's not nearly as good as the rally mechanic, but I would kind of disagree unless I could see it done in practice. And this becomes like a whole issue of like trying to determine the, proper balance of SotE fragments against bosses and whatnot. But I feel like they have enough poise for the most part that rally wouldn't be enough to deal with a lot of their chains. Like, you can't interrupt them as well as you can many Bloodborne bosses. And this is actually one of my bigger complaints about Elden Ring in general, not Shadow of the Erdtree, although it's the same thing. I think Bloodborne's combat was much better designed for boss encounters, especially the giant bosses, because of things like limb breaks, being able to give you tactical windows, which you can add more punishment to a boss while they're kind of crying over their broken limbs and stuff, which kind of sounds pretty callous, but it's true. And Jay Dixon, welcome back in. The summons can create an emergent gameplay moment. You finish the final boss for the first time with Ronnie and Crucible Knight cosplayers. You'll never forget that. And yeah, I'm not saying like those things shouldn't be in the game at all. I think they should. But for me, that like I don't get as much enjoyment out of that as kind of mastering the mechanics for myself. And when the enemy attacks kind of get divided between myself and multiple targets, I don't get as much appreciation for the enemy movesets and figuring out how to solve them as I would if it was just mano-a-mano. Asenex said Limb Break was the best part of BB. You will fight over that. I agree. Well, I don't know if it's the best. I think Rally is phenomenal, but just like it's so easy to overlook like how impactful things like limb breaks really are, but it really does add a dynamic level of strategy in live fights against bosses. Of course, Parl is a bit of a meme about it because its limbs are so breakable, at least, when it's in Parl form. But when you're facing against Dark Beast Loran, or whatever it's called, the Loran Dark Beast, then when its limbs don't break so often, it feels really good to finally get one of those so you can start doing some uninterrupted damage against something else. Okay, cool, Halo, thank you. The broken limb mechanic in BB was never well telegraphed. Sometimes like they'd play a sound effect when they got broken open, and a lot of the bosses would kind of like fall over and like clutch their limbs and stuff. Rally, parry, limb break, trick weapons. Yeah. Asenex said making the boss act like you're hurting them is nice. And yeah, I definitely agree with that. For sure. Anyway, let's go back in.
I don't just care about winning, even if the encounter is something I don't enjoy. I find this valuable because I want to have a stronger understanding of what's going on in the encounter, positive or negative, so that I can draw stronger conclusions about my experience with it. I also just find it more satisfying to win this way. So no, I'm not going to use ashes, and I'm going to continue not to use ashes right up until I no longer believe that they make the play experience worse.
And I know this kind of statement will frustrate some players where they're like, hey, I'm like, why aren't you using this stuff? You're choosing not to use it and you're crying. Well, the devil's in the details there, and he said it's not as satisfactory if he does. And I don't really think you can fault anybody for feeling the way that they feel about a game to an extent, as long as they know why they feel that way. Like, there are certain aspects of a boss encounter or certain mechanics that I could come to appreciate because I might not be interacting with them properly myself. But it's another thing to understand the mechanics and elect to not use them because that gives you more enjoyment, which is why, like, if you ever go into somebody else's stream and they're doing a challenge run, are you going to say, like, hey, what are you doing? Why don't you level up? That'll make the game a lot easier for you. Like, you're playing wrong. Like, you're not going to say you're playing wrong because they've chosen to play that way. So, like, what is functionally the difference in a way between the challenge run versus choosing to not elect or not to use certain mechanics like this. Of course, like the challenge run might have a few more parameters, and there might be an element of the unknown for just like a random streamer or player who doesn't like necessarily know or remember all of the mechanics because they learned about them 40 hours ago and forgot because that when they learned that 40 hours ago, that was a month ago. So there are elements which I'm willing to like budge here, but hopefully my point is clear despite all that.
I'm not really interested in tools that allow me to bypass a boss's moveset rather than engage with it, and I'm not really interested in having an experience that I don't like for reasons that are only passingly related to difficulty be made trivial and still unpleasant, as opposed to difficult and unpleasant. The long and short of it being, the only problem Ashes could solve is lowering the amount of time I spend with a boss, which comes at the cost of knowing less about that boss. In this sense, I think you could say I value my understanding.
To be fair, you can use certain ashes to not necessarily lower the time with the boss if you're choosing like much more defensive ones. So what I did against Rolana, because I didn't really want to use spirit ashes, is that I used level 1 skeletal militiamen. So that way if they did damage to her, they did like 8 damage at a time. But it just gave me enough of a window to heal or cast Rot Breath on her when I got into the second phase.
And my rules of play more than my time.
And of course there are like the shield fallen hawk boys, whatever they're called.
Which leaves us with the conclusion that Ashes wouldn't actually improve my opinion of any of the content, and I wouldn't know what I'm talking about, as I'd have to engage far less deeply with enemy movesets. There's a lot of things I've noted in this video that I may not have even picked up on if I'd used Ashes. And if I reached a point where I wanted to use Ashes, essentially the whole point of my interest is defeated. I'd rather just play something else. Which is a sentence I've found myself saying quite a lot with respect to Souls as of late, and especially with respect to this DLC. I'd rather just play something else. If I'm looking for a combat challenge, I'd rather play a game that's more mechanically rewarding along that axis. And I have many that I've played, and many more that I haven't to choose from. Even along the memorization linear challenge axis, I have Sekiro right over there with its boss select, superior combat, and vastly superior bosses. A bit further afield and I could go back to the Hollow Knight pantheons.
Actually, yeah, I'm curious about your guys' opinion in chat about how you feel with Sekiro's bosses or like Shadow of the Erdtree or Elden Ring's bosses. Do you guys have a preference between one game over the other, or is it a little bit unfair to compare bosses? And should I just ask about like the combat systems? And which would you prefer? To an extent, I do think it's a little bit apples and oranges because Sekiro is an extremely curated experience based off of one's particular build. So you either follow that build to an extent or you kind of suffer. Whereas Elden Ring theoretically is supposed to be about having a lot less limits on your build options, so you're more free to choose what you want, which then I think goes back to the point of, hey, if you're not choosing the builds that are best set up for success, then you're playing the game wrong. And I think that's kind of like the crux of the issue with Elden Ring, that certain builds aren't as viable against bosses than others. Jack does not like Sekiro's combat. Asenex has not played Sekiro. You still like that they had refights? They did add those in. That would be nice for Elden Ring as well. Galaxy prefers Sekiro. Captini said Sekiro's bosses were the hardest and the best, except that Snake weirdo guy with bandages. I'm assuming you're saying Snake. The sniper ladies. Hey, Jay Rizzle, nice to see you again. Sekiro, you have the ability to trigger the bosses in and out of different actions real fast, which makes things easier. Doomfist, welcome back in. Ever since you finished Sekiro, you had an itch for more of it. Halo said, the comparison makes no sense because Sekiro literally punishes you for not playing its way, which was his complaint to begin with. It's hypocritical. No, I would disagree with that entirely, because if he wants to play... Like, the difference is Sekiro doesn't give you options to play differently. Like, you sort of can, but they're so much more limited, whereas Elden Ring gives you, like, all it has are options. And the issue is, like, a lot of these options don't feel particularly viable. Captini says Sekiro has more skill expression than other Dark Souls games. I would agree with that. Okay.
Elden Ring, and especially Shadow of the Erdtree, bank hard on combat, and specifically boss combat, as a focal point. But the fundamentally thin mechanics of Souls have been stretched far too thin, which has rendered the whole affair deeply unsatisfying to me. There's only so much pure memorization I can find engaging before I head off to play Simon Says instead. And the other reasons I had to play Souls games have atrophied even further in this DLC. The legacy dungeons, level design, encounter design, atmosphere, and experiential aspects of the series have been rendered vestigial by this point. The open world is a slightly different kettle of fish, in that I think FromSoft have made some genuine progress in one direction at the cost of compromising other aspects of the design, but I'm gonna hold off on that until after the parts of the game that are more clearly and distinctly breaking down. Starting with the legacy dungeons. I was really disappointed with the design of the legacy dungeons in Shadow of the Erdtree. Level design has been on a general downward trend for a while in Souls games, with any positive developments rendered more or less irrelevant by the prevalence of warping, which Shadow of the Erdtree takes to the absurd nth degree. Elden Ring already had an issue with warping trivializing the nature of the world, as you don't even go from checkpoint to checkpoint anymore. Anytime you're outside of a catacomb and out of combat, you can go wherever you want, to any grace you have unlocked with the press of a button. We'll be coming back to this once we talk about the open world, but even for the legacy dungeons, it has this effect of neutralizing their sense of place. Your engagement with them is extremely non-committal, in that you can leave any time, you can come back any time and retain your progress. Warping isn't even the real issue here, though. It's the design of the legacy dungeons and the profusion of graces within them. I was persistently shocked by how little I was facing in the way of resistance before hitting the next grace. It was very, very rare for me to run out of Estus between graces. And if I did, I can almost guarantee you it was to particular larger mini-boss type enemies rather than to the nature of the encounters present. So to say, the health loss was more brought about by a single difficult enemy, and much less frequently by more curated encounters, where the nature of the enemies and the environment works together to pose a greater threat. Seemingly the best that FromSoft can muster in this.
I would be curious to see what he thinks is better about the previous games that invalidates... Maybe I shouldn't say invalidates, that differentiates his experience from Shadow of the Erdtree. I think like the only FromSoft game that really feels more challenging for the environmental parts would be Dark Souls 2 and arguably Demon Souls, but both can be really mitigated just by their consumables and being able to stack virtually infinite amounts of them. So Halo, you did not like Sekiro because it was less engaging doing the same thing over and over. It's quite boring and unreplayable. That is, I think, a fair and justified criticism, but Sekiro is very clear about like what its combat is, and it's either you have that one option or you just dislike it and put it down, whereas Elden Ring feasibly has a hell of a lot more than one option to deal with boss encounters or like just like combat in general, and it doesn't make every option as viable as other options. And I think the issue is because Elden Ring is so robust with how many options it gives players that there's always going to be a level of mismatch between boss encounters and the player's build, which are going to vary between player to player that can't really be accounted for. And so the overall boss design feels a little bit, I don't want to say sloppier, but like looser than a more curated experience like Sekiro or even Bloodborne and the previous Souls titles to a degree. Shadow said Elden Ring suffered from the same thing as Breath of the Wild. Extremely easy fast travel means, yes, high convenience, but low immersion when you're one-clicking your way out of trouble to cross the handcrafted map. Yes, and I do think that they could make more experiences that makes traveling more meaningful, but the other aspect to consider is just how much more slowly the game would play if you had to manually traverse from one side of the world to the other without fast traveling or less fast traveling. Granted, we might have too many sites of grace like on the overworld in the base game and or the DLC, but there's just like so many little issues that it's really hard to pinpoint it down to one thing specifically. Because you could say like torrent is the problem because you can just trivially run past everything, and even without torrent, you'd be able to sprint past most bosses. So you could make the argument that there's not enough enemies that are fast enough to deal with you on torrent or things like that. But I feel like no matter what they chose, there's going to be a significant amount of drawbacks that came with it. So they just kind of prioritize convenience over anything else, for better or worse. And with all that being said, I think they could have changed a lot of the environmental encounters in the open world with, or like to be designed around torrent or to not be designed around torrent, and that could have definitely altered the play experience. But I'd be curious to see like what open world game does this all better that doesn't really feel super tedious to play. Because I mean, I guess I don't really play a ton of open world games, and like the ones that I do tend to be more MMOs, because to have a really large world requires a hell of a lot of investment, which kind of necessitates massive crowdfunding almost, or ew, AI. Anyway, torrent's a gimmick when you have 1,000 fast travel spots. He means less for it. Halo said Dio doesn't really differentiate Elden Ring from previous entries on this issue, by the way. I mean, I don't necessarily expect him to, but I'm just curious now that if he's going to complain about this specific thing, that I'm curious what he thinks is different about Shadow of the Erdtree, or why he's bringing it up within the context of Shadow of the Erdtree, other than saying like he might be growing tired of it. Captini says backtracking feels bad because it's built around fast travel. I mean, even if it was built around backtracking, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily like that, which is a common complaint about the Metroidvania games, to be fair, even though like there's a purpose to a lot of the backtracking in those types of games. Doomfist says base Elden Ring open world is fine for the most part. The DLC definitely has glaring issues. I think that there are some not great points about the open world even in the base game. I don't know if like scaling would be better or anything like that. I think like the best way for me would be to have a dynamically evolving world based on the player's actions or lack thereof. So that way, I've talked about this point before on streams way in the past, essentially that for me, like my perfect Elden Ring would be like, hey, if you beat Godric, then perhaps Morgott beats Renala. And then, hey, if you beat Renala first, maybe Radahn beats Godric. And so if you could kind of curate how the demigods fight each other, so that way you could have like a different challenge toward the end of each run, that would make traveling between each areas different. Kind of like how in Mega Man X, if you beat Launch Octopus, then what's his name? Sting Chameleon's level gets flooded with water. That would be so dope in a game like Elden Ring. I was so excited, like when I first saw that trailer. I'm like, oh my god, you're warring against other demigods. Then maybe they'll be killing the other demigods along with you. Is this all gonna evolve? Like, am I finally gonna get the dream game that I've always wanted? But it just ended up being a lot more static than I was hoping. Which, I mean, isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think Elden Ring is a great game, but expectations, hard to meet them. Chadwick, could you elaborate what the 55 dedicated levels solves what issue for you? Captini says a lot of dungeons and most areas are just broken going backwards. They are not super great as well. I think Dark Souls is definitely amongst the best in the level design, but I don't think that's a very controversial opinion at all. So I see what you mean, Captini. Kyle said it'd be nice if the wandering patrols would be affected too. If Godric's defeated, his men get replaced with Redmanes and Carians fighting for his territory. Exactly. Like, to me, that is like the target metric to hit for like a kind of open world game, but or even just kind of like any game. It just like offers a ton of replayability for like new game pluses, maybe like different endings, things like that. So like what would happen if Godric grafted Radon to him? Like, say like you're going out of your way one game to make Godric your final boss, like he starts grafting all the other demigods to him, so he gets like a bunch of different demigod abilities, and he's like a super monster. It'd be amazing. Like, what if he grafted Godwin to him? That'd be amazing. Or he becomes Godwin, essentially. Hey, Gigantosaurus, welcome back in. Or like, wait, Godfrey? What if Godric grafts Godfrey onto him? So it's like a Siamese Godric, and they like start grafting other demigods. It's the Voltron of demigods. That'd be amazing. Okay, anyway, let's go back in.
Capacity anymore is having enemies hidden round corners, a technique that they abuse comically frequently at this point. There's a stretch in Bellarat in which there is an enemy hidden round a corner in a tightish alleyway, leading round to an enemy with their back turned, and an enemy hidden round the corner next to him. Past that is a larger enemy sitting up against a wall, and, would you believe it, another enemy waiting round the corner. The playbook has worn extremely thin, the way that a jump scare might be novel and pay off atmospheric tension the first time, but become obnoxious and immersion harming the 10th. This particular trick is especially harmful from my perspective because it's once again so meta. It's fine in moderation, but its overuse gives the impression that the entire enemy roster is aware of the existence of exactly the Tarnished being on their way sometime in the near future.
I have mixed feelings about this because I definitely know what he means, and when I'm playing a game like Kazan, which is not a FromSoft game, and I'm walking into a kind of tightly built corridor and I see like an opening into a room, I will stop at the threshold of the room and swivel my camera around to both sides to make sure that I'm not about to get attacked from the blind. So with that being said, this is definitely not an issue that's native to Elden Ring. There were a lot of moments like this in Bloodborne as well. I have the vivid recollection of Central Yharnam when you first go out into the world, essentially. The plaza that has the burning scourge beast on the crucifix has like this little hallway type thing on some steps on the right side of it as you're like heading toward the brick troll behind the closed gate. And you've kind of got this situation going on where there's like a dude over here and there's a guy like waiting to get you over here. And then there's a guy over here that if you try and turn to the right, he'll get you essentially. And then there's like a treasure over here in a tiny, tiny plaza, if you want to even call it a plaza. And there's a guy waiting to get you if you're being greedy and just hone in on the item on the ground. And so I think for me, I look at that as more of a tutorialization about to expect the unexpected. But I will agree that it does feel a bit fatiguing. And at least Elden Ring doesn't have mimics, I guess. Neo did a good job of having you revisit the same places but with different experiences. I didn't know that. That'd be cool. Okay. Mendacious said Lords of the Fallen 2023 was pretty bad with enemies pushing off the scaffolding. They even had to tone it down. I didn't really have too many problems with it. Like, I mean, it happened once in a while, but I'll just say that's a skill issue for a lot of players, to be honest. But yeah, I really liked Lords of the Fallen for what it was. And speaking of that, apparently they just got a huge new content patch, version 2.0 of the game, where they've gone through and completely changed like the combat animations for like walking and stuff and the lock-ons and really upgraded a lot of core features that I wasn't expecting. So, in case if you guys have not played Lords of the Fallen, I would say that's a pretty good Souls-like as well. Some people like Lies of P more. I tend to be more of a Lords of the Fallen type fan, mostly because of like the environment and the visuals and stuff. Even though I think Lies of P has a couple better systems than Lords of the Fallen, but I guess they did update the UI of Lords of the Fallen as well, so maybe it's better in that regard. But I do think Lords of the Fallen might be a little bit too similar to Dark Souls 2. I guess of all the Souls likes I've played, it really is like the Dark Souls 2, and had really sprawling environments and few kind of lamps, except in really odd locations. But anyway, enough shilling for that game. Astinex always thinks treasure's a trap. You thought that treasure specifically was a trap that the NPC set? It very well could be. It is kind of funny when you see like a random garbage item out in the open and like an NPC just waiting for somebody to go grab it. Like Bailey said, Lords of the Fallen really feels good now. You played it a bit earlier? Nice. Yeah, I was actually kind of excited about that update. Oh, they also added like true seamless co-op to go back to shilling for it. Gigantosaurus, they started playing Lords of the Fallen. You beat the first boss, they removed that unkillable boss. The unkillable boss? Are you talking about the Red Phantom? None of the bosses were unkillable. Captini says Liza P is kind of like the Dark Souls 2 of Bloodborne. A little bit. It's Bloodborne 2. Puppet Boogaloo. In all the bad ways. Yeah, if Liza P had Rally... The starting area boss, you can kill him. I mean, it's extremely difficult, but you can kill him. The demon slicer guy, whatever his name is. Early Lords of the Fallen had the Light Reapers show up after the first boss. You can add him back if you take the increased enemy density modifier. Okay. Light Reaper, that's his name. Thank you. Oh, that is true. Liza P does have block regain. I wouldn't necessarily say that's the same as Rally, but sure. Okay, let's go back in.
Maybe they're aware of the progression path too, and where the graces are, and the paths between them. In any case, it's rather an easily avoided trick, and it's very, very played out by this point. Basically, the only other encounter design concept they still utilize beyond this is placing a ranged enemy in an unreachable location to be accounted for while you deal with whatever's in your way to them. This is in principle a good way of adding something interesting to make an encounter more than the sum of its parts. Enemy composition and enemy placement can be leveraged to great effect to present a challenge in a different sort of manner to the way each enemy could be utilized in isolation. The problem is that when every projectile is both homing and relatively fast, it eliminates the positional consideration from the combat, and we're right back to the rollfest. In a context in which enemy attacks will unreliably overlap in manners that make it impossible to not be caught if you try to engage. This doesn't make the encounter impossible, far from it, and we retain the possibility of bringing the main combatants to areas out of the line of sight of the shooter, but this is in itself limiting to encounter design.
I feel like this is not a great argument whatsoever. It's like, what do you want them to do? Like, this feels more along the lines of complaints for complaint's sake, and this isn't entirely novel to the DLC. But with all that being said, I do think that the base game of Elden Ring suffers from not having more accessible ranged options for essentially melee fighters other than using consumables, and consumables kind of suck. So anyway, that's kind of why I really that's kind of one of the reasons why I really enjoy Lords of the Fallen 2023 is because they gave every build a kind of viable ranged option to deal with things at a distance like that. And same thing with Kazan. So yeah, I don't know. I will agree, like being able to home, like have the curving missiles from enemies that you can't really see, that's kind of a real pain in the butt. But I really don't think there's a necessary problem with having a ranged dude be in a tactical position that benefits them from being a ranged dude.
We need a place to break line of sight from the shooter. The alternative, fighting the enemies while the ranged enemy is doing their thing, involves either brute force tanking or a frustrating amount of waiting and baiting to take pokes. Not to mention, it is, once again, the same thing every time. Compare back to the prior games in which the exact same sort of setup is used. There's a span of Undead Berg where you're faced with a few armoured hollows and some more throwing firebombs from a rooftop that's unreachable for the moment. The difference between a firebomb and a homing spell is that the former doesn't track me in anywhere near the same capacity, and so I can use my movement to remain safe. Something that throws a wrench in my fighting of the melee enemies, but rarely if ever threatens me with hit confirm overlapping combos. You'll probably also notice that the terrain is playing a pretty important role here. The narrow bridge makes it difficult to maneuver, and the enemies behind, plus the pressure from the firebombs, corral the player forward into a fairly small room with 2 more enemies, and a third about to burst through the door. Each of the elements at play here is working to create a particular sort of challenge with a variety of different approaches.
Bro, you're literally line of sighting them, the exact same thing you were complaining about a moment ago. This is super cherry-picked, and it's not even, like, good. Because, I mean, if we go back to his complaints right here about belly rot, the only difference is this room is covered, whereas the other one just had, like, a building, essentially.
Testing the player's decision-making and response to pressure just as much as their ability to roll around and stab basic hollows. Or maybe compare with the Channeler and the Berenique Knight in the Undead Parish. It's a big, pretty tough enemy with a caster watching from an opening above. The Channeler's spellcasts are, usually granted, very distinctly audio-telegraphed as a sort of counterweight to the spell's sheer travel speed. You can hear the Channeler performing his incantation, and then the release of the spell, giving you plenty to respond to even if you can't directly keep him in frame.
This is probably a fair thing to point out, that maybe there could be some improvements made in the sound design in the belly rot encounter, but I mean, this isn't substantially different from the catacomb dudes he was complaining about a moment ago, I don't think. Iman says, unreachable, use a bow. And that's like another thing. Like, there are ranged options. Granted, in Dark Souls 1, there really aren't if your build isn't catered to that at all. But Elden Ring is a bit more forgiving on that front, and it has multiple weapon swaps, so yeah, like, you can use stuff, and I would say, like, sure, that might not be as fun for you, but if you're not having fun by getting hit by all this stuff, why? I don't know, man. Like, this isn't different, is my point.
I don't want to come across like I'm laying down strict rules for how encounters of this sort ought to be designed. Rather, my intention is to show that decisions made in terms of enemy placement and the capabilities given to enemies and in what combination have consequences on the way the encounter plays out. A trivially true statement, sure, but one that's important to remember in the context of a game like Elden Ring. The way encounters are in Shadow of the Erdtree, and Elden Ring more generally, seems to discourage looking for positional solutions and encourage rolling.
You just used a positional solution by line of sighting the dude above you and the belly rat guys.
The environment is rarely leveraged for or against the player, as most fights take place on fairly open flat ground, indoors or outdoors, with the potential inclusion of an inaccessible ranged element. They're basic combat challenges in which I'm incentivized to either roll my way to victory or run on by, since the next grace is likely just around the corner anyway. We're back once again in combat land, with all of the problems that come with Souls combat, but without the complexity and engagement of a boss encounter. We're losing out in terms of encounter design to the prior games, which were more thoughtful in their assembly and curation of encounters in a level, and we're gaining really not much in return. With many of
I feel like using Fort Reprimand isn't the best example for this, because you can come in from the back way and kind of change how you approach this place specifically. This is one of the more non-linear pseudo legacy dungeons in the game, ironically enough. The Shadow Keep, you could also come in from the other way as well, and that can change the dynamic, although I guess that might be the intended way you're supposed to go eventually. Belly Rot is a little bit linear. Yeah, so to me it seems like he's more complaining about the linear design but it's not as though like the other games didn't have that problem as well. Like even Dark Souls 1 is very linear. Just the fact that it's interconnected makes people overlook its non-linearity. Captini says, why is pairing so rare with Elden Ring commentators? Good question. I don't know. Halo said the legacy dungeons are well designed and together bigger than DS1. This is more of a pacing complaint. Maybe. Yeah. The pacing, because he's talking about the sites of grace and whatnot. I was going to bring up Stormveil as I think being like the best FromSoft legacy dungeon that they've done yet. But because that was the base game, I didn't want to bring it up initially because this is more about Shadow of the Erdtree specifically. But I don't feel like his complaints are specific to Shadow of the Erdtree right now.
Of the same problems those games had still being present, like the fact that I can run past enemies at all. This is a difficult thing to stop, but it isn't very good for level design that I can just run past every enemy in a level to the next grace.
You could do that in Dark Souls 3, like legitimately. DS2 is the best about not allowing that. DS1 has that issue. I don't remember how good Demon Souls is about that or not.
Returning to the overabundance of graces, I want to make clear why this is such a problem for the game. Graces are checkpoints. They save your progress, allowing you to start from a later point in the level should you die. You can see each span between each grace as a leg of the journey to the end of the level, and in that manner, each leg tasks you with making it through the challenges it presents in one piece. Die and you'll be reset back, losing your collected souls to your bloodstain and risking their total loss if you don't manage to recover them before you die again. It's a very basic kind of checkpoint corpse run system, but one that can be leveraged to very effectively define moments of tension and relief through the careful curation of when those checkpoints are given. I'm sure anyone watching familiar with any game of this sort of setup has experienced the feeling of being out of resources and low on health, and desperate to find a new bonfire or grace or lantern or whatever else, in order to refresh and keep the progress that they've made, and to spend their souls so that they're not at risk of losing them. It's something that doesn't in itself feel good, but that helps to define the reward structure of the games it's present in such a manner that it defines a lot of memorable experiences and higher highs when the checkpoint is found. The ranges within this system, the depths of the lows and the peaks of the highs, are infringed upon when that point of tension is rarely if ever reached. When there's not enough between checkpoints to meaningfully deplete my resources before I arrive at the next one. I end up contending with any given stretch of the game far less than I might otherwise, and I'm asked to attain a much lower level of familiarity with it, or mastery over it before, due to warping, I never have to see it again. This profusion of graces is part of why legacy dungeons in Shadow of the Erdtree feel so small. You're barely faced with anything on your trek between checkpoints.
I think this is ironic because I think this is the biggest catacomb at least, and maybe there's one other that's kind of grueling, trying to go all the way down to the bottom.
Points, and the times in which you are generally just big, singular mini-boss enemy encounters. The Horned Warriors in Bellerat, and everywhere else now that I think about it. Those Horned...
Hey, Jan Jarvis, welcome back in. Jack, you just checked out Liza P. Why is it so expensive still? It does go on sale, but they also just announced the DLC, so with a lot of people, you know, getting more interested in it again, it makes sense to not have it always be on sale. Captini was saying, being out of everything is the best feeling in these games. I definitely understand that. I remember vividly a time in Metroid Prime where I was extremely low on resources and I was trying desperately to either get back to the last save area or to find the next one. And to me, that's like my most stressful moment in a video game where it's like, oh man, I've made all this progress. Is it about to like go away because I'm going to die? And granted, I don't quite have that to the same effect in the Dark Souls, Soulsborne universe type games, but I still do get some varying amounts of that.
Murakumo dual scimitar warriors make up a startlingly large number of these encounters. But even when they show up, it's rare that you have to deal with much after or before them before another checkpoint is thrown at you. This gets bad enough that in the first leg of the final area, all that waits between the first two graces is literally one guy. Just one bird knight fellow on a staircase. Defeat him and you're at the next grace. This startling frequency has a heavily diminishing effect on the positive sense that comes from finding a grace. Most of the time when I ran into a Grace in Shadow of the Erdtree, I had this feeling of, really? Already? Rather than anything approaching relief.
I've wondered about that one as well, and I think that this might be a byproduct of like having different sequences internally for going through the game at different points, because this should be the gate which you couldn't access from the Divine Dancing Lion Theater that got closed off earlier, and it was supposed to come here essentially, and they might have done like the ceiling tree a little bit later, and they didn't really think about this again since they already placed it and it made sense at one point. But yeah, I don't know. Captini says, when you fail that checkpoint in a Metroid game and you need to do the run back to get that progress, does it feel bad or good? You kind of enjoy doing the same thing, running past the new info. It's a little bit of both. It's not so much whether the run back feels bad or good. Sometimes it can feel bad, but it's more about the tension, knowing that I have something to lose, which kind of makes it a bit more memorable for me, I guess. So Philanthropist says, Elden Ring suffers from extremely easy areas, but hard as crap bosses. There's no mid ground. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel as well. Like, the overworld, it felt fine and kind of easy because it's the overworld, and the enemies are not very tough except for like the horn dudes. Like literally just those dudes and maybe a golden hippo, but I mean a golden hippo is just a boss. And when you're in the overworld, you have torrent, and they become so much easier when you don't have to fight the camera. But oh, rune bears. The big rune bears are kind of difficult, but those are mini bosses again. So there kind of really is no middle ground, which is one of my bigger complaints about Shadow of the Erdtree. Like the DLC does not feel like it prepares you for the DLC's bosses in any means. Fast and Carrot, welcome back in. This is the first Grace of a Near Limb. Normally when you get warped to an area, there are 0 enemies before a Grace/bonfire. I don't remember if there's like a legitimate Grace before, or if there's that you just kind of get sent back there because that's where the ceiling tree teleports you. Phantom Leaves, welcome back. Metroid Prime is really good about spacing out the save rooms to provide that tension and release. Absolutely.
I had this feeling of, really? Already? Rather than anything approaching relief. The only times the levels posed any real threat was when they threw mini-boss tier enemies at me, which has the feeling of boss grinding rather than level progression. But the boss, in this instance, has...
I'm not gonna lie, I am disappointed that this dude was a non-respawnable enemy.
Has very little health and can simply be run past most of the time. And it once again puts us in a position of the game's only real moments of challenge or engagement coming from straight-up combat encounters against singular intricate foes in relatively open flat ground. I've been over this sort of stuff a few times now, so I'm
going to back that up. Mike, there we go. Okay, so what was I going to say? Oh yeah, I wonder if part of the reason why he didn't feel like a lot of the legacy dungeons weren't difficult is because they may have been purposely undertuned to accommodate players that don't have a lot of SotE blessings. I don't know how true that is. It's just kind of something that I'm idly wondering at this point in the video. Fast and Carrot said you just get warped by the tree burning and there's no grace. Okay, that makes sense because that's kind of what happens in Fair Missoula as well. This one doesn't respond, but good luck running past him. Pastor said the lion dudes get up way too quickly after a post. It's bizarre. And that's kind of another thing that does annoy me about Elden Ring, that it seems inconsistent when enemies get out of their staggered animations. I had a hell of a time trying to get the visceral attack off on base game Radon when I was fishing for that footage when I was first playing. Hey, without horns? Yes, we are still on the video from the last stream. And also, how you doing tonight?
Real moments of challenge or engagement coming from straight-up combat encounters against singular intricate foes in relatively open flat ground. I've been over this sort of stuff a few times now, so I won't belabor it any further. Suffice it to say, I think this is not what Souls games were ever particularly good at, and I think they're done a disservice by focusing on it.
Oh yeah, the Curse Blades, those dudes are pretty tough, to be fair.
Abundance of Graces further atrophies level design in that it makes whatever shortcuts may exist or whatever complex layouts may actually be present almost totally irrelevant. Take the first leg of Midra's Manse. From the first grace, you head through a few rooms, once again facing down almost wholly unthreatening enemies in pretty uncompelling layouts that do nothing to amplify their danger, eventually finding your way up a ladder and across a few still unthreatening vertical sections and to the next grace. For me, long before I ran out of resources. You then take...
It's not always about resource management as much as it is like tedium. So it sounds like he would have much preferred that that side of Grace didn't exist. So if he got killed by the Hornson dudes later on, then he'd have to teleport back to the first Grace. Which, I mean, sure, it might be a thing, but not everybody feels that way, I guess. So I'm not going to begrudge him for this specifically if he would prefer to have less Graces, but I don't know. Gigantosaurus says the blessings were awful. You get they were worried about high level players steamrolling the DLC. Yeah. Fastened Carrot says it's always been easy to run past stuff too, except DS2. And guess which other game Theo hates? Lords of the Fallen 2023. Global, you just got a gaming PC. Nice. And you played the Half Sword demo as your first game. I've not heard of Half Sword. Would you link that to me in the Discord? And I've also not played QWOP, although I've vaguely heard of it. So Philanthropist says, if a zone is too hard, players should realize that and get better or go find more fragments. Not a fan of Elden Ring's approach of trying to balance zones and bosses for a wide variety of possible players. It's kind of a situation where they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. But I think they may have approached it with the most milquetoast solution. And the most uncomfortable truth would be that they should have gone back and redesigned the base game and the DLC together. Not Shadow of the Erdtree style. A Scholar of the First Sin style, if they were really worried about how players would interact with the DLC. Oh, he hates DS2 as well? Okay. Hi, Jay Dixon. Thanks for joining. You have a good night.
Take a ladder down from here, open a door behind you and a door in that room, and bam, you're back at the first grace. An impressive display of interconnectivity. Which is nice and all, but why do both of these graces exist? The first one, with the shortcut, covers every possible reason I might have to use the second one, or vice versa. The double graces make the shortcut bizarre rather than satisfying, while also depriving it of its utility if the upstairs bonfire continues to be used. And the reverse insinuation is almost more insulting, that FromSoft and the team really thought that that brief span is all the player could take before needing a new checkpoint. Everything in the design of the levels is so deprived of tension, rotted and atrophied, and littered with the true focus of the level design, providing a sequence of arenas in which you can fight singular complex enemies. You almost never get worn down over a sequence of encounters anymore. You either die in a singular combat challenge, or make your way through and find another grace in short order regardless of your current resources.
I do agree that Midra's Manse feels a bit out of place with how many sites of grace there are for how small it is, but I don't know. I also do think it's weird that you have two sites of grace with the High Wall of Lothric and like the Grand Archives, but it's not as though that I'm going to warp to the Pilgrim Butterfly armor, Dragon Slayer armor, and then run all the way to the archives. There is kind of a factor of convenience, although he already complained about warping as well, so it's probably just not for him. Fast and Carrot, you're saying that you think it'd be crazy to expect people to play the base game again to get to the DLC? Well, I think if you're thinking about it within the current paradigm of things, I would agree. But I would have also preferred that the DLC incorporated some new things into the base game to keep that experience fresh. Like when I said more along the lines of Scholar of the First Sin, I really meant more along those lines in terms of like switching things up. But that would have required a lot more work, which is why I criticize them for going with the most milquetoast solution. Solanthropist, you're agreeing a lot with what he says. Interesting video pick as usual. I think this was recommended to me. So, like, honestly, the vast majority of the videos that I watch on the channel are recommendations. I think like 98% of them are probably from Mindspatch on the Discord. But of course, if you guys ever want me to react to a video, if you throw it in the queue, in other words, like make a comment on my actual video, not so much the chat, so that way I'll get a notification and remind myself to add it to the list, then you're always welcome to do so. And we also have a channel for that in the Discord as well. People would absolutely complain. Expecting them to change the base game is a bit much. Counterpoint, we're complaining now, aren't we? I mean, no matter what you do, people are going to complain. And if you bundle it or if you show it as a kind of different experience from the base game and set players' expectations, then I don't necessarily think that would be too outrageous, to be honest. Because you could always just choose to not buy the DLC.
The only one that comes anywhere close to escaping this sort of design is Shadowkeep, though Shadowkeep itself is not even particularly remarkable and is infested with the incredibly obnoxious Fire Knights. The Greatsword variants are quite fun, but the Dagger and Mage ones are a tornado of unreadability, huge damage, unceasing strings, and magic spam. Outside of enemies, though, Shadowkeep makes some decent use of verticality, with a relatively complex layout that makes...
It does annoy me when he just throws out statements like that without really qualifying them. Those are just kind of more personal feelings about them, and my response to that would be get good.
Some use of the vertical space within the rafters sections. It's nothing FromSoft hasn't done before, see the Research Hall and Cathedral of the Deep, which is a bit disheartening, but it's got some design to it. It's used as a hub that connects several areas, which is one of the rare positive results from overlapping Souls design with open world design. Having a particular level act as a hub in this manner gives it a better sense of place, and provides branching, sprawling paths within the dungeon itself to properly connect it to all of these places. This is all somewhat undercut by warping, but at the very least you have to go through it the first time, and it's praiseworthy enough in that respect. My main problems with Shadowkeep outside of its major enemy types being obnoxious is that its two separate sections, the flooded area and the, for lack of a better term, main area, could be more connected. I think this is a missed opportunity to make what would still be mostly a pair of levels feel like one much larger place.
I don't know, I think it's supposed to be more of a fort, so like the castle town wouldn't really be part of the dungeon.
It would also contribute in terms of replay value and variety, because it would provide a different total experience of the levels between entering from one path and entering from another. It seems relatively proven that non-linearity of this sort is satisfying, and it's something that open worlds can be quite good at, especially when the concern of progression gating is gone due to the DLC-specific progression of the TheoTTree's blessing. There was the opportunity to do something great here, but instead we did something just okay and done several times before. Cathedral of the Deep, but again and worse, conjoined to New Londo, but again and worse. The only real connection between them is...
Why are they worse? Like, I would disagree. Like, Cathedral of the Deep, I do like it, but his complaints about it being separated into two levels, the Shadowkeep, is exactly the same thing as the Cathedral of the Deep, because you have the graveyard to go through first. Hey, that's just the castle town, essentially, versus the actual cathedral itself. Hey, that's the research hall, or whatever you're going to call it, the specimen storeroom. I don't know. Fast and Carrot says he's genuinely an insane person. Okay.
Is the ability to hop down to the main section of the specimen storehouse from the upper levels, which are accessed through the church district. This is a pretty neat connection, allowing the player to skip over a lot of the outer part of Shadowkeep and bypass the hippo entirely. You even get one of the only somewhat long stretches in the game from backtracking to play the level in reverse. A decision no player would realistically ever actually make, or need to, but a decision nonetheless. The far more common experience, even if you do find this skip, would be to warp back out and then enter Shadowkeep through the front door by killing the hippo. And the level...
It's not necessarily true. So I killed the hippo, and then I left the Shadowkeep, and then when I came through the back way first, then I explored everything, and then I was like, what is going on here? So then I came back down and explored it from the back. Granted, I like to explore a lot, and he does not, so that's a variance of opinion, I think.
Level design in no way accounts for this backwards approach. The shortcut into its room can't be opened as the door can't be interacted with at all, which is one of the things that makes the stretch of the level somewhat longer. And you can't even attempt the hippo more than once from this direction, as once the fog wall is in place, The one leading up into Shadowkeep can't be interacted with for subsequent attempts.
Is he a fan of that? It kind of sounds like he is. Or is this actually a complaint? This is weird. I didn't know this.
There's a lot of potential in an open-world Souls game for varied sorts of experiences of the exact same level, but it's a potential that Shadow of the Erdtree is completely uninterested in. Just about every legacy dungeon is a straight line from start to finish, littered with graces to make progression completely without tension and annihilate the purpose of shortcuts, giving off the impression that every level has been built precisely with the player in mind, and
I think he has a point of truth to this, but I think the real failing is that he's pinning it all on Shadow of the Erdtree rather than saying that this has been a consistent issue in the games, because they've all been very linear. Like they really have. What's like realistically, guys? What is a level in a FromSoft game that gives you multiple avenues of approaching it that don't feel like curated experiences going from point A to point B, other than I think like Stormveil, which just kind of gives you two really big options. Lane-Del. Lane-Del's an interesting comment. I guess I don't really think of it as like a true legacy dungeon, even though it kind of is. I guess Lane-Del gives you multiple ways to get to the avenue balcony that allows you to go up Grand Sax's wing. So in a certain sense, it doesn't necessarily feel that linear, but I think that's mostly because it's a wider space. Lost Izalith? Oh, that's true. That's actually a good example, provided you do the humanity skip. That's a good one. Jan Yarvis says 5-2 in Demon Souls. That gives you multiple options? Lane-Del and Stormveil make great use of roofs. I agree with that. Fast and Carrot says, there's barely any areas with legitimately long runs between rest points. Think about the Undead Burg. The only time you felt a lot of tension around was holding a lot of souls was after beating the Taurus demon. All right, Ask Next. Thanks for joining us. You have a good night. Fast and Carrot says, only Demon Souls has actually been what he's describing, and you don't even think he's played it? That's funny. The Depths? What's the second way to get into the Depths? I know you're right. I'm assuming if you have the key, you can go in early? That would make sense. Jack Irish has a big stinky cat harassing him. Maybe you should wash that big stinky cat.
Homogenizing them into near-identical, flat, hollow experiences. So, if not for the combat, if not for the curated, more designed levels, what else is there?
I guess you can skip a big portion of the Untended Graves, or not Untended Graves, what it's called. The Tomb of the Fallen Giants? No, because Nito doesn't really fight you then with the Catacomb skip. Yeah, so I think other than Dark Souls 1 and having like the Master Key, there really aren't a ton of totally non-linear levels, so it's a little bit unfortunate the way that he's framing this argument.
Them into near-identical, flat, hollow experiences. So, if not for the combat, if not for the curated, more designed levels, what else is there to play for? The answer should be fairly obvious. We're left with the open world pretty much exclusively. To Shadow of the Erdtree's credit, I wouldn't strictly say that it made the open world worse than in the base game. Damning with faint praise, I know, but I imagine you've already picked up that I wasn't the most fond of the idea of making an open world Souls game to begin with. To my mind, a lot of what makes Souls games interesting to play in the moment-to-moment levels is the encounter design. The curated and careful use of space and the enemies within it to present particular sequences that challenge the player in ways that no single part of the encounter does by itself.
Which I think is ironic because of how much he's already dumpstered on it just moments ago.
It's like the Souls games in general, the use of the parts in a way that makes them more than their sum. This is, as you can probably imagine, quite hard to do in an open world space. You have so much space to account for, and some of it, almost by necessity, is going to be wide open. This is fine to an extent. We don't necessarily need every facet of the level to be this intricate Undead Burg style affair, but the problem is that so much of the space is wide open in a way that neuters the game's ability to do anything interesting with the enemies and layouts at its disposal. And this is long before Torrent gets involved, single-handedly rendering almost every single hostile entity in the overworld entirely unthreatening due to their inability to keep up with him. The game literally cannot present encounters to me when I can speed past them. It can't threaten me or provide me with any cause for tension in my exploration of the open world. I mean, it even doles out extra Estus charges for free, usually long before you're in any position to need them, and grace saturation is not sparse enough to justify the extra pick-me-ups. In order to create an open world the size of Elden Ring's, capable of delivering the sorts of tightly designed sequences that make Souls levels what they are, FromSoft would either have to get really, really creative, or essentially have infinite time and money to pour over every last scrap of space in the game. Because the simple fact is, the more space that exists, the less time the developers have to give to any particular part of that space. This is all base game stuff, though. Stuff that applies to Shadow of the Erdtree as well, but I'll try not to bang on for too long about it. Suffice it to say, I don't think Elden Ring does very well at combining the concept of an open world with Souls' design sensibilities, and I think both sides are suffering for it. The Souls side suffers from a loss of care and attention, and the open world suffers from a lack of variety in gameplay styles or possible things to do, as all the Souls formula can really offer is combat and exploration, the latter of which being somewhat reliant on novelty, which open world design sensibilities tend to damage.
How do you guys feel about what he just said there about that being all that the Souls games can offer, the combat and exploration? I don't think he's fully wrong, but I also don't think he's fully right either. I think the issue is that it tends to be all that it essentially does offer, and it isn't necessarily all that it can offer. I think the games are enriched by having more NPCs and quests, but it does become a little bit repetitive when literally every place that you go to is kind of like a post-apocalyptic wasteland in the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion. And even the base game was mostly like that, but there were a couple pockets which helped add a bit more characterization to the world and a bit of a reprieve from everything else, like Jarburg, until you complete Jarburg, of course. And like having the nomadic merchants around and like somebody else to talk to, like Millicent. You do have some of that with like Letta and Freya, but with them all being completely Miquella aligned, the game or the DLC feels very, very sparse and empty once you complete the main quest of the DLC, I think. Fan Leaves thinks this is pretty reductive. Global says cap. Mendacious says, if the game was designed for experienced players to have scarce resources, imagine what it would have been like when everyone was new. You only get flasks if you fight stuff. The Wickermen can easily knock you off Torrent too. They can. But you can avoid them. So, yeah, I have really mixed feelings about this. I do think that the overall experience could have been tuned and tighter in general. I'm not going to deny that. But, yeah, I don't know. I think some of it is just the framing of what he's saying. Fasten Carrot says, being free to engage or not engage is a feature of open world and not a fault. I agree with that as well to an extent. Captini says the Souls games for him are mostly about atmosphere and story. You just like the combat a lot. I can understand that. I mean, I enjoy it to an extent, but I'm not crazy about it. I mostly play for like the story and the lore and the vibes and the environment, I guess, a lot. Gigantosaurus thinks Elden Ring needs tons of NPCs as well. Hey, Corin, welcome back in. In Souls games, you get a special element of challenge that's inspiring, that you've overcome a challenge in a way that most games don't offer. So, one of the points I wanted to bring up about him complaining about just running past everything in the open world, you can do that. And so, this might speak to a larger issue with the game design, where he doesn't feel as though it's rewarding to go through these encounters and explore, which I think he's being overly reductive, like somebody else had just said a moment ago, because yeah, you can run past the Wicker Men and you could just not get the SotE blessings that are like next to the America statues and like the Mesmer camps and stuff. But you're also going to be missing out on a lot of content, which can be a good and a bad thing. So like if there's content worth picking up in places, then you're incentivized to do them. So if you choose to run past everything, of course you're not going to be rewarded. Like, no duh. So one of the questions becomes, why does he feel the need or the desire to run past everything, I suppose? That might be good to hear some thoughts on, but I don't know if we're going to get that. With that Horn said, having optional encounters makes them a lot more memorable. That's true. I was going to bring up being invaded by Anastasia in the Smoldering Church. Because the funny thing was, that's when I was leaving Limgrave for the first time. So Anastasia ambushed me at that church. I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And then Melina pops up and she's like, forgive me. I have been testing you. I'm like, oh my God, she sent this assassin to kill me? She ain't joking around about finding the proper Elden Lord. And then I found out much later that it was a coincidence, which is really funny. I kind of like that idea that Melina would send out a hitman to kill you if you would chump, so she could get attached to somebody who's actually good. But anyway. He's the type of person to run past every enemy in Dark Souls 2 and complain about the game being full of ganks. Did I feel tension in that moment when Anastasia attacked? I did, yeah. Because like invasions are rare enough that they kind of stand out in the game. Like I pretty much remember where all of the invades are for the most part. You have Anastasia in the Smoldering Church. You have Anastasia again in like the northwest part of the world, by like the whatever it's called. Then you also have Anastasia in the Consecrated Snowfields. You've got the Sanguine Noble in the Snowfields. What are some other random invades that aren't Quayline for the DLC? Like I said, I remember them all, and then I'm struggling after just one character. I guess I'm thinking of the player invades, like you invade Juno and blah, 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 blah. Let me think. Don't look at chat. Oh, yeah, of course, the Vike invade is pretty memorable. The Dung Eater invades are memorable. So they could have added more elements like that to get you off torrent and stuff. And I think they should have had like more environmental designs funneling you into choke points that you need to mitigate at least the first time around, and maybe like unlock a gate or something to go through it later. But the open world has its pros and its cons. For me, like some of the pros of the open world were the random teleports. Like I will forever remember the moment I got teleported into the Celia Crystal Caves and then walked out into frickin' Caelid. That was phenomenal. Yeah, I did list the Mount Gelmir Anastasia. That's what I meant by the Northwest. I couldn't think of what to call that area. Okay.
In Shadow of the Erdtree itself, there is actually some give and take in terms of the way the world is put together. I had bemoaned in the base game that exploration was overcrowded with copy-pasted dungeons with uninteresting layouts and irrelevant rewards, and Shadow of the Erdtree cuts down heavily on dungeon saturation, and those dungeons that are present have a bit more going on in terms of structure and differentiation. I'd maybe even be willing to hazard the opinion that some of them, like the Bellarat Jail or the Forges, are better designed than the Legacy dungeons. Still terrible boss quality at the end, and encounter design isn't exactly greatly improved, but we'll take what we can get. The biggest loss is that there's no dungeons quite like Ruinstrewn Precipice, which effectively gets across the sense of progression visually and serves the gameplay function of connecting Altus and Liurnia.
I really do like Rune-strewn Precipice. That's probably one of my very favorite areas in the game. Like, I don't know what I would rank it, but probably top 5, to be honest. It just has a certain vibe to it. It kind of stands out, and just like the view and like the mystique of that area is very fascinating, especially on the first playthrough of the game.
Ignoring, of course, that warping makes this mostly moot past the first run. In its stead, there are more in-between level spaces like the route down to Abyssal Woods, or
Oh, Captini says the worst part about the open world is exploring and jumping at every little place, adding 80 hours of just being a silly little guy. Is that feeling worth the other personal cons you have with the open world? No. uh, I think that's fair. They probably could have added more things to make that a bit less tedious. The one that annoys me the most is Master Lasat being in a hidden wall in a mountainside, essentially, or like a ridge, whatever you want to call it. Uh, Also, it is kind of garbage getting completely sidetracked by the painting in the Shadowkeep and missing the Abyssal Woods. Like somebody that I know did. Certainly not me.
all of Rao. A positive development to be sure, as this use of space gives the zones a bit of identity back in terms of structure as compared to everything else, but it comes with the encounter design deal breaker of enabling torrent.
All right, so I'm going to back this up just to read Grass and Carrot's comment and address that, then look back at the video. He said, what is an irrelevant reward? Are you expecting a game with 300 plus weapons and countless builds to always reward you with something useful for you? Yes, actually I am. And that might be unreasonable, but I can't help but feeling how I feel. Like, it sucks to go into a place and you feel like there's no reward for doing so if you're not the type of person that's motivated for exploration's sake. I will maintain that one of the worst parts of Elden Ring is its reward structure. That I don't think the game should have shipped in the state that it did with its current reward structure, because it's not rewarding enough to go back and do a bunch of side content that isn't relevant to what you're interested in. But to be fair, if you made all that side content more rewarding, then you're adding a lot of tedium if you're just trying to do like the main quest. And I don't know what the proper balance is between that and like the open world state. And I don't even know if it's a problem that can be solved. So I'm not like trying to dunk on FromSoft and say like they need to get good and find the solution, because I legitimately don't know if there's a philosophical solution to this kind of thing other than having some redundancy in rewards, or having a system where like defeating certain enemies gives you like parts to, like, create their equipment from that stuff, rather than just having generic smithing stones or like hammers to upgrade all of your weapons, or hilts or things like that. It's a really, really rough problem to solve, and I think if anybody does solve it, they will probably be sitting on a gold mine, and they should patent it before anybody else steals it.
It's mostly moot past the first run. In its stead,
how does that contrast with the rewards in Dark Souls? Because Dark Souls is a more linear game system as far as like the progression goes. Your sense of progression isn't always about the material rewards, because there are a hell of a lot less optional areas. And when you do those optional areas, they often are capstoned with a boss at the end. So you'll either get a bunch of lore pertaining to that boss or the area that you're in, or a kind of boss soul / remembrance thing to potentially have a new weapon or spell to play around with, or a reason to think about changing your build to do that, depending on the game, because you couldn't respec in DS1. So there, like, a lot of that was just kind of integrated holistically in itself. Whereas in Elden Ring, when you go into the Weeping Peninsula catacombs and you get Lutel there, why is Lutel's spirit ashes randomly in this catacomb? And who would even tell the difference between switching the Lutel spirit ash as a reward versus Oleg or Ingval spirit ashes? Like, none of this stuff is diegetic to where they're found, essentially. So Elden Ring feels extremely arbitrary. Whereas even if like literally all of the items in Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 were placed arbitrarily, they feel as though they're purposely placed there because of the context in which you obtain them for the most part. And like there are exceptions to that. Like there's a bunch of spells that it's like, okay, this is just kind of randomly here. So don't like take that as like a true gospel as fact or anything like that. But a lot of people have more fun and enjoyment theorizing. It's like, oh man, why was Havel's set in An Orlando? Was he plotting to kill the gods? Like, there's stuff like that which can come out of it, which I don't think people feel as free to do in Elden Ring. And when they do, I also like to spoil their fun and point out how like the position of many items changed between 1.0 and the retail build of the game. Mendacious Cat, if you also removed all those useless rewards, the world would feel way emptier. True. Giganto asks, why does the Weeping Zone exist either? So you could see that hill and climb it and conquer it and say that you climbed that hill. Hawkshaw shots fired? I said sharts. No, that actually wasn't a shot fired at Hawkshaw. Like, I enjoy the fact that he's able to come up with those theories. I think it's very fun to think about, even if I don't think like his broader ideas stand up to scrutiny. And that was just kind of like one arbitrary example that I could think of off the top of my head. Who doesn't like opening a chest and finding an arteria leaf? Hey man, that was important to somebody, bro. Your trash is somebody else's trash. That chest was a trash can.
Instead, there are more in-between level spaces like the route down.
Yeah, Korn brings that up very succinctly there with a lot of the justifications for certain things being placed in the games is potentially for world building and atmosphere, which I think is a very valuable component to a lot of games that gets overlooked by many people. They're like, why is this here? This is so stupid. Like, I remember seeing a review for Path of Exile 2 where somebody was raging about the fact that in one of the areas there's a looted tomb or something like that. A looted room that's like empty. And it's like, why did the developers put this in here? Why did they put this in here? I had to go and find it only to find that there's literally nothing in here. I'm like, when I found it, I'm like, oh man, this is cool. Somebody's like already tomb wrapped this spot. So we had like completely different experiences with that. So although world building can hit for some people, it doesn't necessarily hit for everybody, but I still do think it's a valid thing. And it does add a lot of enjoyment for me at least.
Onto Abyssal Woods, or all of Rao. A positive development to be sure, as this use of space gives the zones a bit of identity back in terms of structure as compared to everything else, but it comes with the encounter design deal breaker of enabling Torrent. These connecting paths, despite the damage done to them by Torrent and their general disinterest in encounter design, present parts of the world that are somewhat memorable in their own right, both due to their connective quality and their differentiated visuals as a result. This is, in principle, good. In the absence of anything to do but discover or fight, it provides a reward for exploration on the discovery side of things, and allows for a sense of progression in the nature of the spaces you go through that helps convey the journey and the scope of the world. There seems to have been a greater degree of thought put into how to put the world together, even if some amount of it strains against making diegetic sense to me. The way to the SotE altar being so out of the way, for example. I think it would be very much worth FromSoft's while to make the ways these spaces connect make more sense, if only to help bind the world together in ways that don't raise puzzling questions about why the only way to some huge expanse of land is through one small cave hidden off in a corner. At the same time, though, the presence of less obvious connections and more hidden away sub-areas gives the player all the more reason to be excited to interact with the open world. In any case, the DLC through Shadowkeep and Rao manages to take a step closer towards playing with the combination of more traditional open spaces and more closed-off Soulsy areas to decent effect. Some interconnectedness would be
Oh yeah, Rao is probably one of the more non-linear spots to a degree.
Appreciated, alongside perhaps some more route variety to create it, as not every zone can be reached from more than one angle, but it's certainly a start. And it's certainly an improvement. It's a shame, then, that those Soulsy areas are so lacking, and that the open sections are so without tension or consequence. There aren't really many moments I can recall that I had while exploring, because nothing in the world is fast enough to catch me if I just run past it, and the geography's role is hamstrung by the presence of warping and the lack of opposition in non-combat forms. Even the good old poison swamp barely means anything anymore, as it can't poison you while you're on torrent. I understand that on the whole this is a difficult set of problems to solve, but it's a set of considerations that need a lot of attention if the games want to take this direction as opposed to the difficult boss pattern path.
At least he's recognizing that it's a difficult problem to solve, and I would say the converse side of that is that I guarantee that if this dude was knocked off of torrents so often, he would be frustrated at how inconvenient the game is. I don't think there's a way for FromSoft to completely win this other than having a few curated events where you get dismounted a bit more often. Actually, maybe the base game does do some events like this a little bit well with the Eye of Sauron, but I mean, you could still use Torrent to zip through it. It's arguably better to do that. So I think that's just kind of a bigger problem with Elden Ring and its open world nature in general. Gigantosaurus, you're expecting dinosaurs appearing in this area? That'd be pretty dope. Rao, while cool, also suffers from extremely easy enemies and encounters. Yes. Mendacious says man runs past content and complains the game let him. That is kind of my takeaway as well.
As it stands, traversal and tension in the open world are arranged in an egregiously convenient manner. Free warping anytime you're out of combat, a horse fast enough to escape any sort of threat with a double jump for platforming, and little beyond that in terms of mechanics dedicated to traversal. There's even a free stake of Marika outside of any field bosses. Convenience like this doesn't lend itself well to much beyond zone-out junk food style gaming in terms of the experience it provides. Just wandering around for however long to burn time, with no particular sense of the specific game you're playing and the experience it's presenting.
What does that even mean? He's just saying words now.
It's not that the game needs to be Death Stranding Souls or something similarly outlandish, but it certainly needs to be able to offer me more than familiar enemies in familiar sorts of arrangements in flashy-looking but weakly experientially designed zones that I more or less only interact with by utilizing lukewarm combat mechanics.
I can understand that a bit more, but I think the issue comes down to him just not finding encounters rewarding, which may or may not be. I mean, that was definitely his experience. So I think this is one of many issues coalescing into what he believed to be an underwhelming experience that probably could have been improved from multiple vantages, I guess. Yeah, that's what I think as well, Mendacious. Death Stranding Souls? What does he even mean about that? So what he says is that he wants more meaningful traversal, but he doesn't want the game to become Death Stranding 2 Souls Boogaloo. Which I can understand that, and I can appreciate that to a degree. And I think part of the issue is some of the examples that he brings up are so flippant and at odds with his style of playing the game that it kind of comes across as being frivolous, even when there is validity to it.
To really excel in the combination of Souls with open world, we need to do a bit better than a Souls level, but without the threat of enemies, and with the disparate parts of it stretched across more surface area. It's worth disclaiming though that broadly speaking, I'm just not fond of open worlds. I tend to think that they, in their current conventional nature at least, are fairly opposed to game design practices that I find compelling. I'm not really won over by large quantities of content if the quality of that content is diminished by its volume. There being lots to find isn't interesting when most of it is just another barely differentiated weapon, or another armor piece that doesn't particularly do anything different from any other. Or god forbid another Spirit Ash or upgrade to do with Spirit Ashes.
I do kind of understand where he's coming from. It might be a little bit too high of a barrier of entry of switching your weapons up, which could probably improve the feeling of reward of like getting new items and stuff, because the cost it takes to actually upgrade something is pretty damn high, and the kind of rewarded runes that you get in the DLC is pretty low in comparison. And then you also have to have all of the bell bearings in the base game to get the smithing stones that you need to even upgrade your weapon to the max level to hope it is even viable in the DLC. So that was another complaint that I had about the DLC, that I wish that there was a more redundancy, and this is a base game problem as well, in terms of the upgrades for like getting smithing stones and things like that, because it's kind of annoying trying to remember where all 4 bell bearings are if you skipped a lot of content to go to the DLC, because a lot of the content is relevant to you in the base game if you started a new character at least, or even if you didn't get everything the first time around. Like, how are you supposed to know that a random bell bearing that you need is in a random mine in Altus Plateau, essentially, the one in the very center of the map? So for me, I was really excited checking out some of the new DLC weapons. As soon as I found the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, I fell in love. I switched my build to use it. Had a lot of fun using it, even if it was kind of frustrating at certain points. I've still really enjoyed myself. It looks like he also used another DLC weapon, but this one is a little bit more on the beaten path than the AMOG, I guess. So the question is, how do you make anything rewarding to somebody who's already found their kind of build, I guess? And there really isn't a super easy solution for that, other than, I think, having more rewards draw from enemies that aren't generic. So for me, I was wondering if Elden Ring would have been improved if you could craft items from enemies according to their armor set that they wear or their weapons, as well as potentially getting your RNG drops of their items entirely. So let's say that if you were fighting the soldiers of God, you need to get like 4 sheets of like plate metal or something with Godric's design on them to make their chest plate, but they also had like their 10% chance to drop the chest plate automatically. Or yeah, I mean, those are just, random numbers. It doesn't really matter what they are. So that way you could enjoy fighting enemies if you want to keep doing that. It could give you a reason to keep farming if you want to. But if you didn't want to do it, then it really wasn't a big deal for missing on that kind of reward. But I don't know, man. Do you guys have my permission to fill my car with bees? Permission denied. Access not granted. You don't need it, and if you do, it's not an irrelevant reward. Yeah. Isn't this weapon in the first area? This one, I think this is the one you might need to get from. No, is this the dragon one? No, Giant Hut. I don't remember where you get this. You might be right. Oh, is this Milady? Probably, because he's a Karian boy. I thought this is a katana. Fasten says, this game already has more weapons than any of the other games. 2 or 3 times as much, at least. It has more weapon categories than Bloodborne has weapons. To be fair, Bloodborne kind of has like a doubling up problem where the trick weapons kind of count as 2 weapons each, but even so, Elden Ring would still vastly outscale that. Mendacious says, only having 3 remembrance duplicate altars when there's 5 plus remembrance bosses was also a choice. It was a choice indeed. We need lightsaber weapons? You do. It's the coded sword. And the cipher pata.
Especially when the content these rewards are contained in are haphazard collections of enemies standing in open space, with perhaps a mediocre to bad boss fight which, in this DLC, is all too often an NPC. And outside of the boss fight or chest or what have you that marks the end, it's hardly ever even those things. It's crafting materials to help prop up the incredibly superfluous crafting system whose only purpose in life seems to be polluting the loot pool with things the player will never see or care about again.
I agree with that to an extent. The issue is you need to kind of opt into a lot of the crafting, which is useless if you're not opted into it.
I sure am happy I picked up more thin beast bones, and I can't wait to use them to never even a single time need or want to craft an arrow of any kind in these games.
Actually, yeah, Korn brought it up. I was going to leave it alone, but Kazan actually does a lot of this well. It's probably similar to Neo 2 or Neo 1. I haven't played them to really know how they work with their loot, but basically, you can get item drops from enemies and you could dismantle them for materials that you can use for things later on, which is nice. But the weapons themselves also have stats that come with levels according to your experience and whatnot. So whenever an enemy drops an item, it can essentially be useful to you eventually, unless you're trying to go from like a magic weapon to a rare to like an epic. But that's okay. Fasten says, what do I mean by opt into? Okay, so if you never bother to use warming stones, then you have no reason to craft warming stones, and so you kind of need to opt into the crafting system to care about it. You also have to find a lot of the cookbooks, which is really awkward, and if you're playing like this dude and you're not exploring a lot, you might not even have all of them, so that's kind of another odd point with the progression and the reward structure of Shadow of the Erdtree. Like you get teleported into the Skidoo realm and then you pick up a rata fruit but have no way to make anything with it. That's kind of really funny, really.
When exploration's reward is discovery, such as the lift down to the underground sections in the base game or the pathways through the side areas in the DLC, that's something I'm more able to get behind. Which is why finding more bad loot than interesting set pieces like this makes me less interested in going looking. It's the issue I raised earlier where the volume of content needed in an open world game diminishes its ability to present novelty. With so much space to account for, it's unfortunately somewhat inevitable. In a game less interested in presenting itself as a combat challenge gauntlet, these sorts of systems might be more enticing, though they would still need less half-baked integration and more robustly designed encounters to apply them to instead of a mere sandbox.
I agree with that. Anyway, Joseph Bulkin, welcome into the stream. Bring back the bring back slow souls. Dark Souls is an adventure game, not an action slop. The reaction to the new games killed the way the old games worked. I mean, can you blame them if the new games are way, way, way more popular than the OGs? I can't. Unfortunately, capitalism is what sells. That's just how it goes. Don't blame the devs, blame the players who buy into it. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they bring back a slower type of game eventually, but so far what they're doing is working for them for better or worse. I do worry that FromSoft might be a little bit too insulated from like a lot of I don't want to say criticism, but let's say like constructive feedback. Maybe I should say feedback in general, and they might not improve at the pace that I'd like them to improve, but that's kind of the nature of being a bit of a critic myself.
A sandbox is put to good use by extremely varied kinds of interaction, typically. The sort of thing that Elden Ring just doesn't offer.
Oh, Fast and Carrot says, there's seemingly a market for slower games, yet no one's making them, probably because it's hard to make that interesting now. I think there's probably a grain of truth to that. And so for Joseph, with you going off in the chat right now, and Fast and Carrot and Soholanthropus, it sounds like you all would be big fans of AI Limit, which just came out last month. I have a video where I talk about the demo on my channel. It kind of feels like a more modern-ish, with an emphasis on the ish version of like Demon Souls in a bit more of a sci-fi type setting. So that sounds like it might be up your alley.
Extremely varied kinds of interaction, typically. The sort of thing that Elden Ring just doesn't offer. And Shadow Tree fragments only make this worse. As I said, there's 50 of them littered around the game world, with many just lying around, and many more hidden in very obscure or hard-to-reach locations. Very few hidden behind an actual challenge of any kind, and certainly not anything unique. As I explained prior, I'm not really interested in an aimless scavenger hunt for strict statistical progression that overpowers my regular statistical progression. I'm not sure if this sounds strange, but to try and demonstrate, imagine if in the base game, instead of dungeons and catacombs and heroes' graves and whatnot with their disparate rewards, you found items littered around the floor periodically. These item pickups would have within them a huge stockpile of upgrade materials and enough Lord Souls to give you several levels. I can't speak.
What? Wait. Is he being serious about this, or is this a joke?
I'm not sure if this sounds strange, but to try and demonstrate, imagine if in the base game, instead of dungeons and catacombs and heroes' graves and whatnot with their disparate rewards, you found items littered around the floor periodically. These item pickups would have within them a huge stockpile of upgrade materials and enough Lord Souls to give you several levels.
This sounds like the dumbest thing imaginable. It sounds like he wants meteorites and terraria in just like randomly on the ground in Elden Ring.
I can't speak for anyone else, but this consolidation of the reward of exploring in such a way that overpowers the old form, being runes and thus levels, makes the whole affair feel very flat. It waters down the RPG mechanics to the point of near irrelevance in a game that already struggles with the relevance of its RPG mechanics. I rarely, if ever, have to make noteworthy trade-offs to set up a build, as
Rewind again, please. I will, because this is just throwing me off. I'm gonna maybe back up a little bit further. How did he set this up?
reward is discovery, such as the lift down to the underground sections in the base game or the pathways through the side areas in the DLC, that's something I'm more able to get behind. Which is why finding more bad loot than interesting set pieces like this makes me less interested in going looking. It's the issue I raised earlier where the volume of content needed in an open world game diminishes its ability to present novelty. With so much space to account for, it's unfortunately somewhat inevitable. In a game less interested in presenting itself as a combat challenge gauntlet, these sorts of systems might be more enticing, though they would still need less half-baked integration and more robustly designed encounters to apply them to instead of a mere sandbox. A sandbox is put to good use by extremely varied kinds of interaction, typically.
I think I figured out this dude's problem with like traversal and torrent. My man's wants to have like OG invasions happen to him. Is he playing offline or no? He's got ghosts, but he just wants a reason to get off torrent and have more meaningful combat. He just wants to get constantly evaded. If it sounds like, I mean, that might not actually be what he wants, but it kind of sounds like it solves all of his problems about there being too plentiful graces, torrent existing. I don't know, man.
The sort of thing that Elden Ring just doesn't offer. And SotE fragments only make this worse. As I said, there's 50 of them littered around the game world, with many just lying around, and many more hidden in very obscure or hard-to-reach locations. Very few hidden behind an actual challenge of any kind, and certainly not anything unique. As I explained prior, I'm not really interested in an aimless scavenger hunt for strict statistical progression that overpowers my regular statistical progression. I'm not sure if this sounds strange, but to try and demonstrate, imagine if in the base game, instead of dungeons and catacombs and heroes' graves and whatnot with their disparate rewards, you found items littered around the floor periodically.
Oh, okay. I understand. That was a terrible time for me to have cut him off earlier. So he's kind of satirizing his point here. Okay.
These item pickups would have within them a huge stockpile of upgrade materials and enough Lord Souls to give you several levels.
He's saying that is the equivalent of getting a random SotE blessing. That makes sense, I guess.
I can't speak for anyone else, but this consolidation of the reward of exploring in such a way that overpowers the old form, being runes and thus levels, makes the whole affair feel very flat. It waters down the RPG mechanics to the point of near irrelevance in a game that already struggles with the relevance of its RPG mechanics. I rarely, if ever, have to make noteworthy trade-offs to set up a build, as stamina is plentiful even with little to no investment, mind is a luxury at best for most builds that aren't pure mages, and health eats a mandatory 60 levels per playthrough.
Pretty much. You could probably get away with less if you're doing a super ranged caster build. I don't know how viable that is in the DLC. I think Teen Sith said she managed with 40, but I'm kind of doubtful. So anyway, Joseph said, there's not enough puzzle fights in Elden Ring. You don't get why people hate them. I think the issue is the implementation of the gimmick fights in the FromSoft games just kind of not working out super well. I think literally the best gimmick fight in all of the FromSoft games so far has been Rykard's. And then beyond Rykard, you have the Storm King in Demon Souls as a really good gimmick fight. Which, I mean, I can't even really say that's really good. It's a functional gimmick fight. It's good. I do think Renala's fight is designed extremely well, but it's kind of ruined by like a bunch of sound balance type stuff. But the phase 2, she's just too easy is Renala's problem. But yeah. I do agree that I think the FromSoft games could be enriched by having more puzzly gimmick fights if they were done well, but they just haven't been done well. And we need look no further than dealing with Yorm and the Ancient Wyvern in DS3 for them being kind of a meh. Fool's Idol works? I don't know about that. Fool's Idol works if you have a way to mitigate it as soon as you walk through the fog wall for the first time, if you can deal with the gimmick. But if you have to die essentially to fix your mistake, that doesn't feel so great to me. Now, I didn't say Rykard's boss fight was a puzzle. I said it was a gimmick. Forge Forge, nice to see you again. The best gimmick fight in the game is Mesmer's. The gimmick being the tears in your eyes as he kills you with a grab for the 8th time in a row. Truly the greatest gimmick. If anything, I would say that Radahn's gimmick is even better, from the tears in my eyes from the epilepsy strobe warning as he EDM dances over my corpse for the 200th time in a row.
With how damage scales in Elden Ring, and the lack of pressing need to put points anywhere else, there's really no point in being a glass cannon. So when many of your stat increases go to your relevant damage stats anyway, it puts a bit of a damper on things to see how little they matter as opposed to finding more SotE fragments. Sure, you're doing both, but one of the two, SotE Blessing versus levels from runes, is going to have a much, much larger impact on your immediate power.
You know what? You guys might not like me saying this, but I'll say that as a gimmick fight, I really enjoyed base Radahn, unironically. Now you're like, what the hell? That's not a gimmick fight. I would argue that his hidden first phase is a gimmick fight. Literally just getting to Radahn is a bit of a gimmick. It was a real pain in the ass the first time I was doing it, trying to figure out how to consistently get to Radahn without taking damage. But then I actually had a lot of enjoyment figuring out how to strafe between like the spears littered in the battleground to block his sniping shots, and then like going over the ridge to get around the side of him, using the ridge for line of sight. That was quite fun. And so like that's not like traditional gimmick, but it had gimmick elements in it that I enjoyed.
I think this is a fairly poor stopgap for the unpredictability of player power coming from the base game due to Elden Ring's open world nature. For my own part, I would prefer in the first case that the player be asked to do anything at all for their SotE fragments, and secondly, that instead of hiding them in hard-to-reach places, something more interesting might be hidden away instead. Something with some lore insight or some particularity to it in any way whatsoever. Because what I want from the world is the discovery of novel, interesting parts of it, rather than my Sekiro prayer beads that supplant the importance of my levels. Hell, Sekiro even has the good sense to hide its attack power increases behind major boss kills as a means of curating the player's power at any given stage. Shadow of the Erdtree tries this to an extent, but also allows you to collect 34 of a possible 50 fragments without a single boss kill. In an RPG, I would like it if the build decisions I make have ramifications beyond some of the weapons I get access to. In Shadow of the Erdtree, that's basically it. Everyone I send in there is going to have 60 vigor, with remaining points divvied up between the damage stats for my weapons, with maybe a few stamina and mind levels, and they will all be wearing whatever armor it is that I can find, as the distinction in power between armors is pretty minuscule.
That's not really true, but I mean, Fashion Souls is certainly a thing for a reason.
Their capabilities don't meaningfully differ, beyond my Faith character having access to the I no longer wish to play setup of the Blasphemous Blade with talismans to restore FP. I could play a pure mage, but I don't really enjoy pure mage gameplay in Souls, and I don't think it's very well designed. I think the enemies account for it poorly, and even still, I'm going to be the same character, but with a stick in my hand instead of a sword, and so...
Halo says that was always true in Souls games, though. I don't know why everybody seems to believe that, but that's kind of demonstrably not true for the most part. I think there might be... like, there are edge cases, so... I think when people think about armor, they want to be able to completely mitigate damage, and if they're not doing that, then it feels not great. But I think perhaps a more realistic way to look at armor values in a game like Elden Ring, Dark Souls, and even Bloodborne is how many additional hits it will allow you to survive. And sometimes in a game like this, all you need is just that one additional hit to survive that allows you to kill the boss. And people kind of overlook that. So people like always say that armor doesn't really matter in Bloodborne, but I intensely disagree. And if you disagree with me, then I would encourage you to play either a naked run of Bloodborne or even a foreign garb set, because you can definitely feel the difference in enemy hits if you're not wearing better armor than like the starting stuff. Oto says you can reduce damage down to 2/3 even in Elden Ring. Mendacia says defense can get nutty if you get it that high. And yeah, of course, I'm also talking about like not abusing things like endure as well. Just even like the base stuff really does matter quite a bit. Oh, you meant his criticism of stat allocation mattered. Okay, okay. So Lanthropist says the level up progression system also needs to change. It's old and archaic. I agree, but it almost becomes a case of like if you change everything at once, it doesn't resemble what it used to be anymore. And I think that's probably the best thing to do if they're going to go with like a new IP like Elden Ring. So I do wish it was a bit more avant-garde with some of its system design for sure. Fastened says, why is it archaic? This might be unfair, but this is a common criticism that I levy against the games that why are there stat requirements for wielding weapons or armor? It just feels really arbitrary, and that's part of why I don't like want to try an RL1 run, because I can't use the builds that I want to use. I can't cast the spells that I want to cast. And you could make the argument that they should all scale to your individual stats. And as a contrary point to Elden Ring, you could look at a game like Sekiro and see that that game is able to function without arbitrary stat requirements on items. Granted, there are like the spirit emblems things and skill points as well, but the general point stands. Oto says it's not archaic, but it's more like the stats do so little. Yeah, on one hand, the stats do extremely little, but they also do a lot. It seems like most of your damage comes from literally upgrading your weapon, so your stats kind of feel negligible for the most part while you're leveling. And it's really like once you get these certain breakthroughs that things start feeling good, and it just kind of doesn't really feel entirely necessary. Florge says, who needs no armor runs? You can fight any boss with negative resistance thanks to Rakshasa's armor. And Datakar's woe. Okay. Rakshasa doesn't increase the damage taken. It just has really bad defense. It's essentially pointing at the 6 or the 9 side of the number.
Some more mind. My boss gameplay is fundamentally going to pan out in a similar way, putting square pegs in square holes, so to speak, in terms of finding the right spell for each punish window. And I'll also have less Estus due to the need for blue Estus to keep hitting, one of the only legitimate trade-offs a player makes when choosing character capabilities. The RPG mechanics are almost entirely worthless in Elden Ring, and Shadow of the Erdtree seems to agree, committing to all but replacing them with a more action game style of general statistical enhancement, necessitated as a form of progression due to combat not being something you can even meaningfully improve at past a certain point. All told though, while I think the open world could stand to improve in a lot of ways with the curation of its content, its connection to itself, and the variation in the content within it, it's the most understandable thing I can see to like about the game, and especially the DLC. The sense of discovery is hampered for me when the majority of what there is to discover is loot or combat encounters, but I can understand it. It's like Skyrim. You boot it up to bumble around for a bit and have relaxing fun times. I don't think this speaks positively to its design, but it certainly speaks to the appeal. The problem here is that Elden Ring is a game caught between two different kinds of appeal. Certainly the people valuing it as a combat challenge and praising its boss design would not be satisfied with the conclusion that it's Skyrim, but with somewhat more robust combat mechanics. There is this perception in some parts of the communities around it that it is more than that in some sense. Souls games have some degree of prestige to them, some communal perception that they are more serious artistry than something like Skyrim might be. Certainly once upon a time, these games seemed to be trying to achieve something a bit greater than a world to turn your brain off and unwind in.
I was just thinking about this. The whole Skyrim comparison is kind of funny in a way because I think at a baseline level, a lot of people's experience with Skyrim varies wildly between each other because of how many people just mod the game and don't really even play vanilla. So, of course, there's probably a lot more consistent sense of an artistry in Elden Ring versus Skyrim when people do be modding their stuff, I suppose. But setting that aside, I don't know like if these comparisons are fair. It just feels like a little bit cherry picking or like slyly mocking Skyrim for not offering what he wants. I don't know what he really means with Skyrim and its combat. I've only ever played Skyrim as a Metroid like because I like to be a bow user essentially.
Even Elden Ring, with its intense and incessant combat focus, falls into this camp. If you're looking for open world shenanigans games, Elden Ring seems to contain a sizable design focus on things you're not necessarily there for. So what we're left with is a game that excels at nothing that it does. It emphasizes combat, but is outshone easily by more combat-focused titles, even ones as close by as Sekiro. It presents an open world, but one with deeply limited forms of engagement and exploration that often fails to present anything new at all.
I would kind of disagree with this, and I think the whole point of Elden Ring is that it's supposed to be a spectacle. It's about grandiosity, and part of that grandiosity comes from having the variety of choice between 300 weapons, 50 plus spells. Granted, I do think that they should have more varied enemy encounters, and I don't mean like enemy encounters, I mean like enemies as well. It did get very, very stale, even in Shadow of the Erdtree, with how few enemy variants there were, and the base game suffered from that as well, especially when anybody ever goes to the mountaintops of the Fallen Giants.
A non-zero percentage of the time in Shadow of the Erdtree, your reward for exploring is a boss. Some percentage of that amount, it's a repeat boss. Sometimes an NPC boss, or just an NPC invasion. All of which are combat-focused trials with little going on outside of the combat aspect. Your loot for these...
How is that fair, though? Because the points where he's like, hey, these are combat trials, what does he want? Does he want those meteors on the ground where he could just pick up everything and get like super powerful? Oh wait, you already have that with the Shadow Tree fragments, but he doesn't like that because you have to explore to do it. Like you can't have it both ways here. Like you're complaining about literally everything at this point without like a lot of consistency or like yeah, just internal consistency, I guess.
These fights is frequently uninteresting and just as frequently useless.
Global, he can redeem everything right now by ending the video with nah, I'm just kidding. That'd be pretty dope.
It seems to me that a player looking for an open world also has a large number of better options for that sort of experience. We're left with a generic blob of a game, enjoyed by everyone but loved by no one.
Bro, come on.
Clearly the loved by no one part of Matt's point here has not come to pass, seeing...
Oh, he was quoting somebody? He should have said like quote or something. I was like, bro, how can you literally say this straight voiced?
We're left with a generic blob of a game, enjoyed by everyone but loved by no one.
Doesn't help that like the closed captions don't have quotes either.
Clearly the loved by no one part of Matt's point here has not come to pass, seeing as Shadow of the Erdtree is widely beloved, and Elden Ring even more so, but I think he's on the money about the homogenization of the game. Just about every reason I might have to play a Souls game over another sort of game is gone with Shadow of the Erdtree. Any sense of groundedness has long since vanished, the combat design is no longer anything I'm interested in, I find the narrative elements inscrutable and unsatisfying as compared to the more thematically cohesive prior games,
Hey guys, I agree with that point. Feels bad. I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff in Elden Ring. It's just not cohesive, and that's kind of like my biggest complaint about it. I'd really like it to be cohesive, but my goodness, if it is cohesive, I don't see it. skill issue. All right, Phantom Leaves, thanks for joining us. You have a good night.
The level design is weaker, the atmosphere is weaker, the majority of the immersive quality is gone. For any given thing that I could play Shadow of the Erdtree to get, I can get it better elsewhere.
I do think it's always a bit ironic when he talks about the lack of immersion. He's doing Midra's Manse when this is probably one of the most immersive points in the entire game, with the Abyssal Woods offering a completely different experience from the rest of the game. And he hasn't even like mentioned that once. It's just kind of interesting, I guess.
And rather than being more than the sum of its parts, Elden Ring's parts either do not support one another or actively conflict. The open world causes problems for the combat through the RPG mechanics, with the DLC solving this by smothering the RPG mechanics through the Shadow Tree fragments that, due to the DLC's difficulty, will mandate exploration for some if they're unwilling to keep bashing their head against the wall, forcing the player to modulate their own difficulty in a way they're not at all equipped to informedly do while violating that player's freedom of approach.
I think that criticism right there is valid and 100% on point.
And it's exploration in a sense of running around and picking things up, as opposed to finding content to engage with. And the narrative obfuscation of Elden Ring has reached a point that it's difficult to contextualize the meaning of your actions in any way, while the game simultaneously refuses to manifest any form of consequence for your actions.
I feel like if he had just used any of the Elden Ring fractured endings here instead of the fight against Leda, that would have illustrated his point better than anything else could have. You wonder what he thinks about Demon Souls? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Maybe he has a video about that. We could look at that after this.
All this then to come around to a point where the combat can be trivialized through statistical progression without even really meaning to. It feels more and more like FromSoft would be happier making straight-up action games. To do that, though, it's far past the time for the systems to evolve. Because in thinking about boss design, in thinking about how inscrutable enemy attacks and behavior are...
Oh no, I wasn't trying to say like we'll actually watch that video tonight, Global. I was just going to see if you had it.
and how simple the mechanics are, I've come to the conclusion that if there is a need to constantly escalate challenge, as informed by the old guard who have conquered everything prior, a lot of these measures are somewhat inevitable outside of systemic improvement. If you have to make ever harder bosses, they have to get more complicated. They have to have less downtime and tighter punish windows. They have to demand more precise rolling and timing, and maybe they even have to start subverting conventional design behaviors, or the laws of motion and physics, or even just sensible behavior in a fight to match up to the player's unbelievably powerful roll button.
Which is why I really enjoy having more options in the Soulsborne genre, because I feel like Kazan has taken Soulsborne combat but made it better by having it be more focused on action stuff, but still at its core remain a Souls-like in a way. This dude would have an aneurysm playing Kazan. I agree, but I'm saying that if you actually want to have more grandiose bosses, you need to also have more grandiose player moves. So I don't think Elden Ring or a FromSoft game needs to go completely in the direction of Kazan by having it be like that high paced. I think you can do that on a slower level and still be very successful with what you're setting up. But it feels like these dudes are playing Shadow of the Erdtree as the bosses in the DLC, but we are still in Dark Souls 3.
The Souls framework lacks combat design space. There aren't many levers you can turn, and we've been at this for 6 or 7 games now, depending on how far you count Sekiro. Something was always going to break at some point. The combat needs non-trivial adjustments. The inclusion of mechanics like guard counters, or customizable Ashes of War of which many are uselessly slow boss super moves, or throwing weapons that eat unbelievable amounts of stamina for no reward over a regular swing, or a stance break mechanic that's essentially a watered down version of Sekiro's posture, or a jump button that functions near identically to a roll in terms of combat, and is obtuse in when and how it should be used, doesn't change that fundamentally the core pieces can't hack it.
I'm surprised he didn't like bring that up a bit more. I mean, he did bring up jumping before, but like not really a lot. That the bosses should probably cultivate in environments where you're more encouraged to jump and be a little bit more legible about when you're supposed to do it. Sekiro did have moments of that when you're supposed to jump over sweeping attacks, but yeah, Elden Ring does feel more limited about that. It isn't Sekiro, so it being as strong as Sekiro would make no sense. It's well balanced in the fight. I mean, I'm not saying that the jumps are imbalanced. It's that the jumping in a combat scenario is not is how do I want to say this? It's not communicated very well to the player when it is advantageous for them to jump. And the game doesn't create enough opportunities to make jumping feel like a viable or a valuable even defense mechanism for mitigating a lot of enemy attacks, with very few exceptions, such as Godfrey's stomps, Rolana's moonballs, and that's about it. Like, those are the biggest jumping telegraph ones that I think are obvious for players to pick up on, because it's kind of a bit of a pass fail. It's not as though like you get a bunch of bonuses for jumping, other than if you're trying to land a jumping attack, which functions a little bit different than using jumping as a movement/defensive maneuver. That's it. We're going back to Kingsfield. Please no. He had a massive fight on a live stream about jumping boss attacks. He was complaining about certain attacks being annoying, and Chad told him he should jump them, and he didn't like that. I don't think that's unfair. I mean, I don't have the context here, to be honest. But as I mentioned earlier in the stream, I think it's really unintuitive that the way to deal with Radahn's multi-meteor attack is to jump while you're strafing. Because that move caught me so often, because it seemed like you should be able to roll, but because the meteors are coming out of the sky, it seemed very unintuitive that I should jump because I'm being hit from the impact behind me that's off camera that I can't see because my lock-on point is in the sky. So like the point that he was talking about lock-ons earlier in the video that was on yesterday's stream, I think does lend to its validity as a criticism here. Yes, you can roll it. I'm not denying that, but I was still being caught while rolling it, and it didn't have as much consistency as I would like, whereas doing the strafe jump strat always worked. If he disappears, why not just lock off? So if he's up in the sky, you can unlock, but then the issue becomes if you unlock and you're trying to run away from the meteors, you can actually have him end up off camera and then continuing to go into another attack string where you would need to be able to see him again. And so it becomes a little bit awkward trying to adjust the camera with your right thumb and also try to evade an attack, which also requires your right thumb if he starts moving. So that might be a little bit not completely true. I don't remember how he continues to move after he does the meteor attack. That one might have a bit of a wind down, cool down type phase period, but it isn't always that easy, especially if you're not even like that mechanically skilled, I guess. No. You're talking about a different meteor attack. I'm talking about the one where he sends like 12 purple meteors. He does not land in the middle of the arena.
Combat clarity suffers due to the power of the roll, and by token of its similarity, the jump. The invulnerability is so strong and so disconnected from what is visually happening that determining a proper response becomes even harder. Invulnerability frames are the single most powerful way a player can defend themselves in a game. Their sparing use can make that power felt, in a limited way, while their overuse crowds out all defensive options that are not invulnerable in nature, with significant effect on how enemies can be designed. Even now, you can clearly see how enemy attacks are overwhelmingly built with the cadence of the player's role in mind. Multiple swings.
I think part of this is because if you're a melee build, you have to stay close to the bosses, so your positioning is more important, which is why when Radahn executed that attack of a 6-string combo right there,
Overuse crowds out all defensive options that
one
are not invulnerable
two,
in nature, with significant effect
3,
on how enemies can be designed.
4. So that was a 4-hit combo that may not have finished, and that's not like one you could interrupt with a true counterattack. You might be able to get some chip damage in, I don't remember, but he is kind of right where the kind of seemingly intended way to deal with a lot of this stuff is to just keep rolling, which he is kind of right where if that's kind of your go-to defensive maneuver, then the FromSoft devs are devs wielding a hammer being the dodge roll that they need to apply to almost every attack. So I think Radahn can also move enough that even if you tried walking away for a lot of these attacks or rolling away, he probably still has enough momentum to keep chasing you down rather than having range to be more of an option. So it's the question is like, how the hell can you balance a boss to be viable against 300 different weapon types and like spellcasters as well? Maybe that's a bit of a loaded question because people weren't complaining as incessantly with the base game. So perhaps it's just one of those unquantifiable things, I guess. Right, that was my point, Fast and Carrot. You run away from the meteors and then you jump the splash damage. I didn't know that I was necessarily getting hit with the splash damage because I would periodically have a meteor covering my entire screen, so I couldn't exactly see what was hitting me. And because the meteors were coming from the sky and I was kind of jumping toward them in a way, it felt bad or unintuitive to jump away from that attack. That attack messed you up a lot? Okay. Joseph doesn't think Elden Ring is the easiest. It's by far the hardest. I think Elden Ring is as hard as the player makes it because there are a lot more options in Elden Ring to trivialize a lot of the boss encounters, specifically with the Spirit Ashes as well as co-op. So if you're playing it mano a mano, I would say it's still not quite as hard as Sekiro, but it feels a bit more frustrating provided you know how to parry in Sekiro. They really should have explained jumping is useful. Um, Even if it gets explained, it's a very different thing having a dialogue tell you that jumping is good versus having to experience it against certain attacks.
Even now, you can clearly see how enemy attacks are overwhelmingly built with the cadence of the player's roll in mind. Multiple swings within your roll's invulnerability period to force stricter timing, the proliferation of roll catches, attacks built to force you to roll in a particular direction at the right timing, so on and so on and so forth. To help with the monotony, From even invented a system of varied responses in Sekiro with perilous attacks. A system with its issues, but one that fundamentally created a need for a variety of responses player-side. Clearly, if you just parried all game long through every last threat, the game would eventually get boring, right?
You couldn't even really do that, and I think Sekiro definitely has a huge edge over Elden Ring in terms of the telegraphing of its attacks, because you need to be able to differentiate a thrust from a sweep from a normal attack that can be deflected, because a thrust can break your parry. No, I guess that has to be a perilous attack. You can block normal thrusts, but you can also Mikiri counter them. But if as long as you can Mikiri like recognize that it's a thrust, you can capitalize on that even if it isn't a perilous attack. So that's kind of one reason why I give Sekiro a big edge over Shadow of the Erdtree in terms of its combat design. And one thing that I think Shadow of the Erdtree really should have improved on to make players complain a bit less. Neo 2 does differentiating very well. I really do need to play Neo 2, huh?
It had become a mere matter of repetition. This sort of dynamic is between not present and obscure in Elden Ring, reliant on guesswork to determine if the game would like you to jump as opposed to roll, with little in the way of clear visual indication one way or the other, or why one would work over the other because of the obscurity of the mechanics. Sekiro gives you a warning, then leaves you to read the animation of the enemy to figure out what to do. Elden Ring just leaves you to figure it out, thus relegating the jump's intuitive use to its most blatant cases, the visual design of which do the game's immersive quality no favours whatsoever.
I wonder if there's a video out there that shows how many attacks can be jumped over in Sekiro that aren't just like the sweeping ones. I know there's a lot of them. I know the Goomba Stomp is actually really effective against Oreen of the Waters, and that's kind of how I learned to use stomping.
And on the offense side,
Methoda, nice to see you again. In Sekiro, they have some kanji pop up though, which makes it pretty clear. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the like danger kanji essentially, but I do think Sekiro could have been improved by having a couple of varieties of kanji with different colors for those who can't read kanji to give players a better indicator if it's going to be a grab, a sweep, or a thrust.
attacks with no distinction in properties means that only the best attack that fits within the punish window gets used, with other moves relegated to near non-existent rolls. Jumping R1 almost never does anything I'm interested in as compared to jumping R2. Regular,
That might be fair.
uncharged R2s are useful only for their increased stance damage rather than anything about the nature of the move.
And that's also true, and it almost feels better to do a jumping R2 instead because you get a hell of a lot more stance damage than just a normal charge. Although maybe the normal charge up for certain weapons comes out a bit faster.
Charged R2s are widely impractical outside of particular boss attacks, given that their only real reward is even more stance damage.
Can you imagine if a big danger sign appeared in Elden Ring? It'd break your immersion a bit. Thankfully, you don't know Japanese. So actually, I can, and I'll show you a bit of Kazan as an example. Let me pull up my footage. Let's do something early. Oh wait, I have my Deathless demo, don't I? All right, so let me get to like the bear and stuff. That's a little bit further, right? Or the boss will be good. Oh, here we go. So, granted, Kazan is a bit more of an action game, but they came up with this unique sigil to show like when certain attacks needed to be countered with like a legitimate counter attack as opposed to just parried and blocked with the normal parry / block. So, granted, when I did the demo, I was still really bad at it. I had to relearn how to do it, so that was kind of my fault, a bit of a skill issue, but it can be done. Yeah, block and square. So yeah, that's the attack. So it isn't necessarily on the enemy, which is probably a bit of a good thing because a lot of players will be looking at themselves anyway, I guess. I don't know, but it's over at least by your health bar, so it's nice and central to what you're dealing with. So yeah, I did it too early and I got hit. I needed to delay that a bit more. So anyway, that was a perfect block. I held it a bit early, but then I let go and blocked again. So they do have multiple mechanics for that. And then I blocked way too late, so I got hit. And so that sound effect was to indicate that the enemy's next move is going to be a grab, and I need to get out of the way. So I think there are ways that this could be done in a tasteful way and be consistent for the player. So that's pretty much all I wanted to show there. Mendacious says From needs more. Mike? Okay. Mendacious said From needs more button combos. Kazan and Lords of the Fallen both use them to great effect. I agree with that. That's essentially the burst counter indicator for Neo 2. Yeah, it sounds like Kazan heavily borrowed from Neo 2. And yeah, Chadwick said there's a rock, paper, scissors element to Sekiro, I'm assuming, but it's kind of fun. Or maybe you're talking about Neo. That is one aspect of Sekiro that I did come to enjoy the more familiar I became with its combat system. Oh, so that's Neo as well? Okay, cool. Fasten said the problem you have with the counter thing was how early it came up. It took you a while to figure out to not press it when the symbol appeared. I agree with that. I actually had to go back and look at a YouTube tutorial to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, because I actually had my Lies of P problem where I countered properly my very first time doing it. So I thought I understood it, and because I only did it once, I did not understand it. And then I got confused why I was continually failing that counter mechanic. So the bears kept messing me up so bad. Joseph said, "You looked at AI limit? It's as fast as DS3? Is it? It did not feel very fast to me at all. Like, some of the bosses were okay, but it just felt really slow to me."
Damage.
Heavenly Sword had a good system for this? I've never heard of Heavenly Sword. They had 3 different colors from enemy attacks, and you need to press different things to counter or avoid getting frame trapped. The colors were also dependent on how big and agile the enemies were. If you have a trailer for that, send it to me. I'd be interested in checking it out.
Statuses don't mean much when they're all fundamentally a means to more damage. Damage in a burst, damage over time, more damage over time, or the other damage in a burst. It's little wonder that the 2 damage burst statuses, Bleed and Frost, are the most powerful. Strong enough to...
And this is one thing that I really enjoyed about Lords of the Fallen. If you kept spamming certain, not like normal statuses on your weapons, but if you kept spamming spells, or any cast of a spell would give you a little bit of a status buildup. So that kind of disincentivized just like purely spamming things from range. And so it kind of naturally encouraged players to get into the melee aspect of things. Come on, little girl. Here. Shimon. There you go. And I think like the way that Lords of the Fallen handled status effects in general was probably the best in a Souls-like that I've seen so far. Yeah, Ocho said it was neat balancing how the fire burned the caster a little. Exactly. And like the holy spells would begin to bleed the player. Really interesting stuff. Chadwick, you like a Muso from time to time? Is that so wrong? No, I have my own guilty pleasure for the Muso franchises as well. So Dynasty Warriors, I really like Warriors Orochi, although it got a little bit out of hand. I kind of got turned off with the Muso stuff when it just became a full-on juggle fest with the enemies. So I particularly enjoyed Dynasty Warriors 2 and 3 the most. And yeah, I would agree that the ranged weapons were also really good in Lords of the Fallen. Mendacia said weapon buffs in Lords of the Fallen also scale off a weapon stat, like lacerating weapon scales off strength for some reason. Yeah, lacerating and poison, I think, go with strength. And yeah, I think that they had a pretty holistic way for the interactions between combat in that game. I do wish that the poise system was a bit easier to interact with if you weren't doing the certain Radiant build, and maybe the new update has fixed that. So crossing my fingers that you could break open enemies endlessly again.
To be a balance concern, even. Once again, I understand that you can boil many things down this way. What do I get from juggling an enemy in Devil May Cry or toppling a monster in Monster Hunter if not more damage? But the difference is in the amount of boiling. It takes simply turning on the heat to reach this conclusion about status effects. None of the tools in my arsenal in Elden Ring have any implication on each other. None of their use cases have any implications on what I am to do next, or what I can do next. Paltry attempts at this have been made in the form of weapons like the Light Greatsword, with its R2s and R1s linking up in different ways to give the weapon a sense of flow, but it's as if From is rediscovering the wheel here. Real action games have understood this idea for literal decades at this point. We're back to pretty covered ground at this point though, and the idea is clear. Souls used to offer something that was harder to find elsewhere through the sum of its parts, and less conventional presentation. More and more of that is being lost to the insatiable focus on complex combat encounters with ever more conventional presentation, while the mechanics behind those encounters remain all but unchanged. And a few ham-handed dalliances into the sphere of open worlds can't pick up the slack. Almost entirely gone are those unique sorts of experiences I can get with the Souls series, but not really anywhere else. The most enjoyable part of the DLC for me wasn't Mesmer, and it wasn't some dungeon or some open world vista. It wasn't some cutscene or some botched NPC fight with a totally mismatched sense of tragedy. It was the Shaman Village. The reminder that Marika, for all of her godhood and all of her grand designs, was a person.
Wait, didn't he complain about this place earlier in the video? Or am I thinking of somebody else's? Maybe I am. Maybe he did not. Maybe I am confusing him with somebody else. Anyway, I do have a question for you guys in the chat, and I also want to lead in with saying that I appreciate you guys who don't necessarily agree with me on everything, because it would be really weird if you did, first of all. But anyway, I do appreciate having a bunch of broad perspectives, and I'm not saying that in a leading way to like make sure you guys give me diversity in your answers. But I'm kind of curious of all of Elden Ring base game and the DLC included. What are your, let's say, top 1 to 3 favorite boss encounters? And don't feel pressured to answer a specific way. Like I'm just curious.
A person with a history and a home. A few notes from the start of the game's main theme, and a fairly humble little vista with a golden tree and 2 items with a bit to read into. It's a quiet, poignant little place, and it's the sort of thing that you oh so rarely see in these games anymore. These moments have been lost, traded for a few more lightning bolts for the dancing lion. And for me, the rubber band of tolerance for this sort of gameplay has snapped. It's another gradient in the same direction, but this is the first one to be, for me, unambiguously too far. Next installment, or the one after that, it might be too far for you too. Thanks for watching. This was a much longer project than any of my prior work, completed or otherwise, and I'd like to say a quick thanks to all of the people who helped make it possible. Shandy and Metal for allowing me the use of some footage, and all of the friends who helped me test, investigate, and refine the script. The help was invaluable, and so were the messages I received from people interested to hear my perspective laid out in full. And thank you again for sticking through the whole thing, whether or not you found the video convincing. I can't say it's too likely I do much more talking about Souls. Between Lost Soul Arts and this, basically everything I have left to say about the series is out there in the world, beyond specifics that may come up in particular subjects. I suppose we'll have to see what the future holds, though.
Oh, whoops. Didn't mean to click that. Okay.
So prepare to roll.
So I already liked this video yesterday. I do actually enjoy quite a lot of the critique that he offered. I think there's obviously a lot of nuance that goes into some of the points that he makes, and it's really easy to get bogged down by the weeds and miss some of the broader points that he's trying to make, because what he says at a given moment might not perfectly align with one's individual takes on things, which is, perfectly fine. Which is why I think it's important to try to understand what the intent is behind somebody's point. And of course, I don't always get that right. And we're all only human, and we all have different perspectives and preferences on things. So, while I did not agree with everything 100%, I did think that he brought up some fascinating points, and that if I were to make a more dedicated critique style video, I would probably be assured to rewatch my own stream to gather some of the thoughts that came up in response to what he offered here, because there's just so much to take in that it's impossible to remember everything. So yeah, I thought this was a very thought-provoking video, and I want to thank you all for joining me in watching this over 2 nights. Whether or not you're here for both of them or part of them, I appreciate it nonetheless. So I went ahead and linked his video in chat if you want to give him a like. I'm curious if he's talked about Demon Souls or anything like that. Wait, how many videos? 5 videos? Did he delete a bunch of stuff? You guys said he was in a podcast. Maybe it just doesn't have a lot. That's fine, because he only has 5,000 subscribers, so it doesn't seem like he went on a purge or anything like that. So when I had asked you guys some of your favorite bosses, you all were saying a bunch of stuff, which is really fun to see. So I'm just going to list them, not necessarily who says them. Sunflower, Mesmer Midra, Fire Giant, Bale, Ancestor Spirit, Lich Dragon, Renala, Tree Sentinel, Morgott, Erlana, Spooky Boatman 1 through 5, aka Tibia Mariner. I'm assuming that's a bit of a joke, but maybe not. Maybe just the style of it. Midra, Mesmer, Moog. Mesmer, Godfrey, Malekith, or Midra. Malekith, Rilana, Mesmer. Sunflower's an honorable mention. Moog, Sunflower, first Watchdog. Interesting. Podcasts on other channels, okay? Renala, Malekith, Morgott. Dancing Lion, honorable mention. I am kind of surprised at how many DLC bosses we've gotten so far. Granted, I mean, those might just stand out a bit more for being like the most grandiose spectacles and being the more recent ones. Pleasantly surprised to see so many Sunflower mentions because I actually did enjoy that boss quite a bit. So for me, my favorite bosses, number one is Moog. I do really like the Midra fight to an extent. What else? Those two stand out to me off the top of my head. I'm trying to think of like pure mechanically why I'd pick a boss. I almost said Crucible Knight, but I kind of don't like it. Like Crucible Knight, I really had a lot of fun crashing on the first Crucible Knight in the Everjail really early, but I don't know if I actually really like them all that much, to be honest. I really do like Rykard as a gimmick fight, to be honest. I don't think that fight gets as much credit as it should, but it really does get brought down for me by how much the second phase ends up being a vigor check or a Vow of the Indomitable check. Without horns, you're glad we got done with this video? Did you know Midra cuts through your shield every time a sword hits it? Can't say I did. Oh yeah, Godfrey. That's the other one that I usually cite. Thank you, Oto. Yeah, so I would say Moog, Godfrey, and maybe Midra in the DLC as some of my favorites. Even though like I wish there was a bit more going on with the Mance, and I don't like a lot of the lore surrounding it. I just think it's a super cool fight in a vacuum, which is kind of hard for me to accept. Chadwick said Estelle was a fun boss, kind of like a stupid dragon. I can't handle how easy Estelle is, but I absolutely love the design of Estelle. Oh yeah, Radigan's also a great boss, but Radigan also gets ruined a bit with Elden Beast. I really did like Radagon. So yeah, in the base game is Moog, Godfrey, and Radagon for me. I probably would place just maybe I don't know, man. I really do like Midra as well. Halo, thanks for the link. Unfortunately, YouTube will eat the link, so I need you to just post it, or at least like the video tag, like the thing on a comment on the video, and then I'll be able to check it out later. Fasten says the design of the Deathbirds is amazing, but you find them annoying. Tell me about it. That's probably the boss that killed me the most. If anyone says the Crucible Knight duo, they need to stop. I'm not that masochistic. Without Horn said Estelle wrecked you with co-op because it was because it was impossible to tell who he was focusing on. Apparently, like my mic cable is not. It has seen better days, I guess. That's annoying. What else? So yeah, I really do think that the variety of our answers speaks to a lot of the strengths of Elden Ring, and there are certainly aspects of Mesmer and Rilana which I find enjoyable. I think they are some of the less problematic bosses of the DLC, but also some of the most problematic bosses of the DLC. It's like once you kind of understand how they work, it can be really fun fighting them because there's like a dance type pattern to dealing with them, but they can be pretty rough when you're doing it no blessings. So yeah, going back to like this video here, um the most that I can say about it is that it's certainly thought provoking, and hopefully going through this and trying to see what he's saying was fruitful for you all. I know that we all have like very strong opinions about this, and appreciate you guys keeping yourselves in check and approaching this in a bit of a good faith manner. So I appreciate y'all. So yeah, that'll be it for tonight's stream. Thank you all for joining me. Hopefully we'll catch you on the next one at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.